Donald Trump would try to define what they did before he would be arraigned in court. So that was one factor. But the most important thing is that they knew, given the gravity, you're talking about indicting a former president of the United States who's running for office again. They knew that they had to let the American people know why they took such a dramatic step. And I'm told that this was not a decision made lightly. I was told last night the Attorney General was briefed down the stretch that this was coming, that he allowed it to go forward, to make a move that puts the Justice Department on the political landscape right now because it's now part of the national dialogue.
And again, Pierre, what made this so telling, this indictment, was willful retention, obstruction, conspiracy, all of these allegations included.
The key here is that they said that Donald Trump had every opportunity to return these documents. Second, they also wanted to make clear that we're talking about the most coveted secrets that the United States government has. Information about weapons, also information about spies and electronic surveillance programs. They took the important step of also listing the agencies that these documents came from. They wanted to leave nothing to chance. They said some of these documents came from the CIA. Some of these documents came from the NSA. Some of these documents came from the Pentagon. They want the world to know this is what he took. And also there's a statement in the indictment that I sort of looked over last week, which says categorically that when he left office, Donald Trump was not authorized to retain these documents, namely that he had not declassified them.
Jack Smith trying to make it very clear in that 49-page indictment, when Donald Trump left office, those documents were not his. They belonged to the American people and the government. You're looking at the motorcade leaving Doral now, headed to the federal courthouse. The former president saying he will plead not guilty, that I've done nothing wrong. And Dan Abrams, we've heard repeatedly Donald Trump saying there's the Presidential Records Act. That covers me. There's nothing criminal here. Those documents I'm allowed to have in my possession. In your opinion, why doesn't that work?
So the Presidential Records Act is basically in place to figure out a way to monitor and chronicle presidential records. It's specifically related to the president. Senators don't have it. Vice presidents don't have it. It's something unique to the president. And then you have to figure out which of the documents are necessarily covered by the Presidential Records Act. And there have been disputes in the past. Should this be covered? Shouldn't this be covered? Donald Trump's position is everything that I had should not have been covered by the Presidential Records Act.
Nuclear secrets, U.S. military vulnerabilities?
His position is that he is entitled to claim all of it as his personal documents. Problem with that is your question, right? If you take that argument to its extreme, that means he's saying he's allowed to take any and every document that belongs to the government and say it belongs to him. The fundamental legal problem with that is that there was a court ruling that made it clear that what are called agency documents are not related to the Presidential Records Act. They're not subject to the Presidential Act. So you can't say
you're talking about CIA,
the FBI document, the CIA document. You can't say those are my documents because they never belonged to you in the first place. There was a big case that came out of this related to Bill Clinton, and it related to him making his own tapes, which he was going to use for a book. And there was a dispute, and a court in 2012 basically said it's kind of up to Bill Clinton because he was president. And the Trump team is trying to say, see, well, that should apply to us. Of course, that's wildly different when you're talking about someone making tapes of themselves and a dispute over should that be presidential records or not. Here you're talking about taking documents that belong to the government and belong to particular agencies. And that's why the argument fails.
And as we watch this motorcade now make its way to the federal courthouse there in Miami, very basic question for you, Dan. Would we even be watching this play out had Donald Trump turned those documents back over to the National Archives?
No, and we wouldn't still be here if he had turned them over to the FBI. So he had two chances, right? First, it was the National Archives. We definitely wouldn't be here if these documents had been turned over to the National Archives. That's how this all sort of started. But then, when the FBI steps in and says, we believe there are highly classified, very important documents that were included here, we need them back. If he had then turned over all of them at that point, we wouldn't be here either. And that's the key, is that there were numerous opportunities. I mean, Donald Trump has talked about the fact that we were still negotiating. Okay, fair enough. If he'd given them to the FBI, even after the negotiation, we still wouldn't be at this point.
And yet here we are, live pictures from South Florida at this hour. You can see the traffic halted on the interstate there to allow Donald Trump's motorcade to bring him to a federal courthouse. Again, history in this country being made yet again with this former president. In this case, now the first former president ever to be federally charged with crimes. This indictment, 49 pages, 37 counts, 38 counts, 37 of them aimed directly at the former president, Walt Nauta, his aide, one count involving his alleged help in moving and hiding those documents. I want to bring in John Santucci, who's been in touch with those closest to Donald Trump in the last hour or so. Give us a sense of what's playing out inside Trump world, if you will, his state of mind as he heads to the federal courthouse.
David, the word I'm told today is defiant. Donald Trump has been busy all morning. As we've reported, he headed down to Miami, Florida a day early, in part to begin interviews with a new legal team. I am told through my sources that those meetings continue today. No new lawyers have been officially hired to join Team Trump. But those were conversations that the former president and his staff were having with potential legal counsel for much of the morning. He's been described to me, David, as having fits of anger throughout the last couple of days. He is very angry about this indictment, the charges, the pictures that were included in that indictment, particularly annoyed this former president. This morning, though, what's been interesting, and it's a reminder of where we were 2 months ago in Manhattan, very similar setup. Donald Trump is in that motorcade right now by himself. He is with his security detail, no lawyers, no advisors, just the former president. And in one of the vehicles just behind him, David, is the legal team that will be with Donald Trump and his aide as they head into federal court shortly.
And let's talk about that legal team, because that is significant, that bit of reporting that even in the 11th hour, Donald Trump was interviewing attorneys to join the legal team. Of course, we have reported it out here that two of his key attorneys resigned amid this indictment. As you're watching the motorcade now, John Santucci just reporting that Donald Trump is in the motorcade alone, headed to this federal courthouse. John Santucci, take us inside that part of what they're still dealing with, trying to assemble a legal team on something so crucial of such weight here.
Well, and David, you have to remember that Thursday night, after learning of his indictment, it was just a few hours later that the legal team that was intact, Jim Trusty and John Rowley, suddenly resigned. And just a few hours later, the indictment unsealed. We learning all of the facts that the special counsel team has built against him. So throughout the weekend, Donald Trump, that group of advisors working the phones. The team that's going to be with him today are two attorneys that have been around for the last iteration of Trump legal teams. What I mean by that is that as the heat has risen around Donald Trump, we know that he has brought in a new lawyer, Todd Blanche, to be by his side in the Manhattan District Attorney's probe. That is the one with the hush money payments to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Todd has become, quite frankly, as one person said to me over the weekend, everything. Todd is the advisor that he is relying on. He is described to people inside Trump world as steady. And that is exactly what Donald Trump needs right now. The other attorney, Chris Kise, has been working some other legal issues the Trump team and the Trump organization have been facing for the last several months. Mainly right now, he is the lead attorney on the New York Attorney General's case, looking at Trump's efforts to avoid paying taxes. So those two are going to be the team for today's appearance, which, as we know, David, is going to be relatively brief. But we are told that by the end of the week, hopefully, an expanded legal team will be set.
John Santucci with our investigative team. Catherine Faulders also with that team. And Catherine, you've been reporting throughout the day today the negotiations right up until this moment playing out on live television. The negotiations involving how he will be processed, of course, making history, but he is a former president. And so all of this is discussed and negotiated at great length before this plays out.
Yeah, there's always a back and forth between Trump's legal team and the government on what they believe is necessary here. Typically, federal defendants, they go in and they're processed with a mugshot. But Trump arguably is one of the most recognizable figures, if not the most recognizable figure in the country. They found that wasn't necessary. We're also told that in addition to no mugshot, he won't be handcuffed. He won't have to empty out his pockets. The process will look, though, David, as it typically does for any other defendant who's going into court, except for some of these accommodations being made for the former president. We know that his fingerprints will be taken digitally. It's not clear whether the no mugshot will apply to Walt Nauta, his aide, the co-conspirator in this case. He could potentially have a mugshot given he is not as recognizable as the former president. But again, we're expecting this booking process not to take long. Unclear whether that happens before or after. But David, process-wise, it really is the same process that everybody goes through, but for some of these accommodations.
Catherine Falder's with us here today. Catherine, thanks as always. Our senior investigative reporter, Aaron Kotursky, is outside the federal courthouse, where, of course, the motorcade is taking the former president right now. Aaron, take us a little more through what will play out in that courthouse behind you.
Once the former president arrives, David, he is going to be taken up to the 13th floor to stand before a federal magistrate and potentially enter a plea of not guilty to those 37 counts charging him with mishandling classified documents. And it is possible he is going to see several hundred of his supporters who have been out here for the last several hours as the time neared for the former president's arrival. And many of them are carrying flags. They're wearing costumes. We've heard a lot of music. There's been horn honking and whistling, and they are all sort of commingled in with members of the press. We've even seen the mayor of Miami commingled in this crowd. Everyone's together in this somewhat surreal carnival-like atmosphere that stands in rather sharp contrast to the gravity of the criminal charges that the former president is facing. The mayor told me a moment ago, David, that so far this crowd is manageable and staying peaceful. He said he hopes it stays that way.
Aaron, stick with us here. I remember when we were on the air, and it feels like it was years ago at this point, but it was just a few weeks ago, the hush money case here in Manhattan, when we watched the motorcade taking the former president to Lower Manhattan. One of the key differences, and there are so many in these two cases, but one of the key differences in that day, as we watched it unfold, was that the former president, once he made it to the courthouse, then was given the indictment, the details of the indictment. He was able to flip through the pages himself with the legal team. A very stark difference here in the fact that Jack Smith put out this 49-page indictment that not only the country's been able to study, but certainly Donald Trump and his legal team well in advance, which could make this move more quickly. But that is, again, a significant difference in just the technicality of sort of how we'll watch this unfold.
And exactly what Special Counsel Jack Smith seemed to want when he made his public remarks. He urged the American public to read all 49 pages and decide for themselves the weight of the criminal charges that former President Trump is facing. You're right, David, because he does not have to go through some of the usual steps that one might do at an initial appearance. It's not expected that he's actually going to be inside this courthouse terribly long. And once he's through this initial appearance with a federal magistrate, his case is going to shift to a judge that he appointed. Judge Aileen Cannon has been randomly assigned the case. She caused some controversy earlier in the investigation after the FBI raided the former president's Palm Beach estate. She inserted herself and inserted a special master, a third party, to potentially limit what the FBI could use from that search. Ultimately, that was rebuked by a federal appeals court. And so Judge Cannon is setting up this rather unique dynamic, David, where a criminal defendant is before a judge that he appointed, yet another in a line of firsts that we've seen with former President Trump.
She will preside over this, Aaron, though not today. These initial proceedings will be a federal magistrate.
That's right. Federal Magistrate Judge Jonathan Goodman is going to preside over this initial appearance and arraignment, where we expect the former president to enter a not guilty plea to the 37 counts. He's a former reporter before he went to law school and did some criminal work in and around Miami and was appointed to the federal bench. He's known as a fairly straight shooter, not anyone who causes any controversy. He's also known for a sense of humor, but we're not going to see any of that because there are no cameras in federal court, David.
You and I capitalized on that same part of his bio, the fact that he was a local newspaper reporter and now is the federal magistrate in a case that will certainly go into the history books as we watch it unfold today. I want to bring Preet Bharara, former U.S. Attorney, Southern District of New York, joining us for our coverage today. And Preet, if you would, take us into this federal courthouse. This obviously, we've talked about Aileen Cannon, who won't be there today, but what more can you tell me about Donald Trump's legal team? We know Todd Blanche, you have a bit of a history with.
Yeah. So first of all, it's an extraordinary thing to see someone like the former president of the United States not have a fully formed ongoing legal team, especially because he's known that these charges might have been coming for a long time. Excuse me. Todd Blanche is now at the helm. I've known him for almost a quarter century. He was in the Southern District of New York with me, worked for me for a period of time. He's a smart lawyer. He's an honorable lawyer. He's a good lawyer. Lots and lots of people have fallen by the wayside because they fall out of favor with Donald Trump, and or, as we've seen in the case of Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, their representations of Donald Trump have caused them ethical problems and sanctions. I don't know if Todd Blanche will last for a very long time. There's a sort of a revolving door with respect to Trump's lawyers, but he's a smart person, and obviously he's gained the former president's trust.
But it is very significant that you would have a former president facing federal criminal charges, 37 counts, and not have a fully formed legal team.
Yeah, look, ordinarily, in the legal firmament, if you have the opportunity to represent a sitting or former president of the United States, that's the sort of legal honor of a lifetime, because it's an important job, because it gets a lot of attention, helps you get other clients. And we've seen in the past when presidents have gotten in trouble, including President Clinton back during the impeachment days, he had at his disposal, as you would expect, some of the best lawyers in the country. Donald Trump does not have that option because of the way he treats lawyers, sometimes reportedly doesn't pay his lawyers, doesn't listen to his lawyers. Look, part of the reason he's in all this mess right now is because of the kinds of things he said to his lawyers. Some of the witnesses at this trial, some of the most powerful evidence at the center of the indictment comes from his lawyers. So it's a sensitive representation, and you have to have a pretty strong will to be able to do it.
And Preet, what do you make of the indictment laid out by Jack Smith? Obviously, we've reported at length, again, the granular detail of what they laid out for the American people. But what do you make of the case as they have presented it so far?
I think it's very strong. And listeners and viewers should realize that one of the reasons it's so strong is at the heart of the case, they have an audio tape of Donald Trump long after he left the presidency in July of 2021 at his residence in Bedminster, New Jersey, talking about being in possession of and showing a document that he's in possession of that was classified, that he acknowledged was classified, that he acknowledged he might have been able to declassify when he was president, but couldn't any longer because he's not president, that it was secret information. That goes to the heart of proving to the jury that Donald Trump was not mistaken, he was not merely reckless, but intentional and knowledgeable about the fact that there are procedures to follow to declassify things, and he was in violation of those rules and procedures. That's what makes this, I think, a very powerful piece of evidence.
And Preet, on our screen right now for our viewers at home, that's the actual quote from the recording for those of you watching our live coverage here today. He said, according, again, to the indictment, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. And to Preet's point there, certainly Jack Smith and his team believe that this shows that the former president knew full well what he wasn't supposed to have long after leaving the White House. Our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, with us here at the desk today as we watch this live picture. And I always think, for folks at home, John, who might have become somewhat immune to all of these major developments involving Donald Trump through the years. And here we are following another live coverage, a helicopter shot, if you will, of a motorcade heading to a courthouse. But I don't want to let it pass without speaking to the history of this moment. This is nothing like what we watched, even in Manhattan a few weeks back. This is history being made. Never have we seen a former president federally charged.
On one hand, you could say we haven't seen a former president of the United States indicted for about 8 weeks, given that he was indicted in Manhattan.
My point precisely.
But you are exactly right. This is different. The charges here are more serious. He is being indicted by a special counsel, by the Department of, an investigation brought to the Department of Justice. These are federal charges. These are serious charges that could lead to significant jail time if he were to be convicted, and it gets to the heart of his oath of office. You swear to defend the country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and here we see that Donald Trump allegedly, as laid out in this indictment, how he treated some of the nation's most sensitive secrets. And reading through that indictment to see the way Jack Smith has described the nature of these classified documents. Obviously, David, we don't know exactly what they are because they are classified documents, but documents that are described as detailing the military capabilities of the United States and the military vulnerabilities of the United States and the capabilities and vulnerabilities of our allies. So the significance of treating information like that, allegedly in such a cavalier way, and the photographs showing the boxes of documents, one of them spilled out over the floor, another in a bathroom by a shower, in the ballroom of Mar-a-Lago, the very ballroom where he announced his third presidential campaign, and then to see detailed the ways in which he allegedly obstructed justice as the person that was at the pinnacle of the United States federal government, defying court orders.
We're watching the motorcade now arrive at the federal courthouse. And John, something Jack Smith included in that indictment with everything else you just laid out was a reminder to the American people that this was a president who won in 2016 based on making an argument to the American people that he would enforce the laws that protected classified information from getting into the wrong hands, from being loosely held, from being disrespected, if you will. He included that quote that we have returned to in our reporting as well, but he included that in his indictment and for a purpose.
Absolutely. And you know, what you're hearing from a lot of the former president's allies, particularly in Congress, is this sense, well, Hillary Clinton had classified documents in her emails. James Comey famously outlined the fact that a handful of the emails that Hillary Clinton had classified markings, that Joe Biden had classified documents from his days as a U.S. Senator still in his possession. Mike Pence had classified documents. This seems to be an entirely different case, both in terms of the volume, the nature of the material, and most critically, the fact that he didn't turn them over when he was asked to turn them over.
And I think that's what's most important for no matter what side you're on politically in this
Yes.
country. This is the case being made here is willful retention, that the former president was given multiple opportunities to turn these back over and did not.
And you know, I think it's significant. You mentioned the judge who will ultimately be hearing this case, Judge Aileen Cannon, is somebody that was appointed by Donald Trump, somebody that made rulings that were favorable to Donald Trump earlier in this very case. You know, some say she's a Trump judge. I recall John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, saying when Trump attacked a judge as an Obama judge during the 2016 campaign, we don't have Obama judges or Bush judges or Clinton judges. We have judges that seek to have equal treatment under the law for those who come before them. So I think this will be a very interesting, you know, test case here, and it's significant that whoever the judge is, and the fact that it's a judge that Trump himself put on the court, I mean, our system of justice, that should be just fine.
And you're looking at live pictures from our ABC station in Miami, WPLG. Donald Trump has arrived now at the federal courthouse in Miami. As you have heard our team report here this afternoon, Donald Trump will be processed, fingerprinted, though in this day and age it'll be electronic, not with sort of, you know, the old school of putting your thumb in the ink, if you will. That'll be registered, no mugshot needed. Obviously, these were all part of conversations, negotiations between his legal team, his changing legal team, if you will, about what he would have to do. And obviously, one of, if not the most recognized man in the world, certainly in this moment, probably does not need to have his mugshot taken. That will not happen. It was unclear going into today whether or not he would be processed after he faces the federal magistrate to initially answer to these charges. And of course, Donald Trump himself has said he will plead not guilty, that I've done nothing wrong. Live pictures now of the gathering outside, and you heard Aaron Katersky report a little earlier. Donald Trump had asked his supporters around the country to protest, to show up in South Florida, to stand up for him. You can see the Trump flag flying there, but as Aaron Katersky described it a short time ago, in his words, almost a carnival-like atmosphere, a mix of those for Donald Trump, those against Donald Trump, and sort of mixed in with the media presence there. Miami's mayor saying we'll be ready, law enforcement is ready, and you can see it in the pictures right there. Victor Akendo is on the ground in the crowd, and Victor, if you can hear us, describe, if you will, the atmosphere. Does the crowd recognize that Donald Trump is now in that building and has arrived?
David, I can tell you right now that it feels almost like a party-like atmosphere right now. You can see all the people behind me here, a lot of flags in the air. Yes, people here were following the news updates. The majority of those are supporters, but you do have those on the other side as well, opposed to the former president. We saw one dressed in like a prison jumpsuit, and not too long ago, some of the president's supporters actually surrounded him. They swarmed him, and police had to step in, break it up, and make sure that that person was safe. But overall, David, I can tell you it has been peaceful out here, exactly what Miami police and the mayor were hoping for. A lot of police visible around where we are right now, but there's even more standing by, on the ready, close by, armored trucks, all of that as well. Keep in mind, here we're right in front of the courthouse, and just 2 blocks away is Miami Police headquarters. They're ready for whatever might come their way. It's tough to give you an estimate on the crowd size right now. It has been growing all morning long and into the afternoon. But as we heard from the mayor, he said it could be 5,000 up to 50,000. They are prepared. David?
Victor Kendo reporting a party-like atmosphere, I think were his words. Aaron Katursky calling it carnival-like earlier. Again, as history unfolds in South Florida this afternoon. Former President Trump now inside, where he will, on the 13th floor, answer to this 37-count indictment. Those counts include willful retention of classified documents, and you've heard us go over just some of what the indictment lays out, though we don't know the full extent. But some of these classified documents involve U.S. Nuclear secrets, according to Jack Smith, U.S. potential vulnerabilities to military attack, how we would respond, vulnerabilities of our allies, among just some of the documents, and that audio recording that you heard Preet Bharara reference earlier, during which Donald Trump, long after leaving the White House, talked about how he had a classified document in his possession on his person at that moment, and saying essentially, I know I could have declassified this back when I was president. I can no longer do that. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but this is all part of this indictment, this case that Jack Smith has laid out before the American people. As we look at the live pictures here in South Florida, I want to bring in Sarah Isgur, who worked in the Justice Department during the Trump administration, the Bush administration as well. And Sarah, you know Jack Smith. What is his reputation? How does he operate? Because the American people have heard so little from him so far.
Exactly. I mean, Jack Smith is a prosecutor's prosecutor. He's known for bringing hard cases against people across the political spectrum. He's also known for being an incredibly aggressive prosecutor. Although what will stand out in this indictment is that it's not legally an aggressive case. He seems to have all of his evidence lined up for pretty simple charges here. You talked about the willful retention of national defense information, but don't forget charges 32 through 37 aren't about the Espionage Act or about whether the documents were classified or marked. They're just false statements, obstruction. It's Trump being his own worst enemy.
Really interesting, and a lot of people have talked about that. John Santucci had reported on that, Sarah, early in this, last week, in fact, that a number of those who were close to Donald Trump over the years, during the administration, they've characterized a lot of what you see in this indictment as unforced errors, that essentially Donald Trump did not need to be in this position.
It reminds me a little of how the Mueller investigation wrapped up. In part 1 of Mueller's report, he said that there was not evidence to bring charges, for instance, against Trump or his campaign related to Russian interference in the campaign. However, part 2 was obstruction. It was once again Trump getting in his own way. And those recordings, the text messages between staff that we're seeing in this indictment, are textbook Trump getting in his own way.
Kate Shaw, our legal analyst, professor of constitutional law. And Kate, so many eyes on Jack Smith when he did come before the cameras, essentially aware of the vacuum that would have existed, the political discourse that would have filled that vacuum had he not come before the American people, not only with the 49-page indictment, but to at least address the cameras for that brief moment. And it was telling what he said and what he didn't say. And he talked about presumed innocence here, trying to depoliticize what he knows has already been politicized in this country.
Yeah, I was very curious about whether he was going to speak directly to the public or just let the indictment speak for itself. I think it is important, and I also think it was correct for him to have kept it very short. So he spoke only for a few minutes. He emphasized the important bedrock constitutional principle of a presumption of innocence, and that presumption applies with full force to the former president. And he also emphasized some players who are not really in the indictment, but for him are clearly front of mind, the intelligence and defense officials who toil day in and day out, protecting our secrets, working to advance the national interest, essentially suggesting that their kind of jobs, and they're sort of at stake in many respects when classified information is, as alleged in the indictment, treated as cavalierly as it was here. So those are players who I think are very front of mind for this longtime federal prosecutor, Jack Smith. And those are, the folks that I think he wanted the American public to remember when trying to understand the story told in the indictment.
And Jack Smith himself, from upstate New York, he went to SUNY Oneonta and then on to Harvard Law. This is a man who grew up in upstate New York, in Clay, New York, if my reading is correct. But he's been tested in the International Court of Law. He has tried some cases at the global level.
So this is a prosecutor who has significant experience in the federal system in the United States, but was also a prosecutor in The Hague investigating high-level war crimes. So this is someone who has worked, around and against foreign leaders and essentially investigating misconduct with the kind of highest possible human stakes at the United States federal government level, but also at the international level. I'm not sure there's anyone who has quite the bio that Jack Smith has in terms of this particular case that he is now bringing.
And Dan Abrams, he certainly knows the weight of this moment. Jack Smith does.
Oh, no doubt about it. And I think this goes back to something that Pierre was talking about the speaking indictment, right? He knew not just that he had to put the details in the indictment, but when does that get released? Think about it. If we were still waiting at this moment for the details of that indictment, if we still didn't know them, right? If we still knew, well, there are roughly 7 categories, roughly 7+ charges, which is what we knew at the outset.
It sounds like what I was saying the night before.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. That's all we knew,
yeah, that is,
right, at that point. That could be all we know today, and it would have created a vacuum, and an important one in the country, where for the last 4 days, people would have been talking about a case where we knew nothing. I mean, one of the things that we talked about is I needed to wait to see the details of the indictment before telling you how strong a case it is. Now we've seen the details. That's the problem for the former president. It's when you do read the indictment, as Jack Smith has asked that everyone do, when you see the types of documents, when you see the conduct, when you see the number of opportunities he had to correct it, that's the problem. That's the power of the case.
And that is one of the extraordinary things about this indictment is that for once we did not need Dan Abrams and Kate Shaw to understand it. He actually wrote it in a way basically to lay out the case for the American people.
It's a very accessible document, and I do think that Jack Smith said explicitly, and he meant it, people should read the document for themselves. So we will help translate and sort of give our take, but I do think that front of mind for the drafters of this document was ordinary people need to be able to understand the story, and they need to be able to understand the gravity. The legal elements actually are pretty straightforward, as Sarah Isgur was just saying, and as alleged in this indictment, they seem pretty clearly to be satisfied. But the law and, the law is part of it, but I think in terms of how the priorities of the drafters, explaining the narrative was front of mind, and it seems, to my mind, like a very successful effort.
The one part that I think is worthy of talking about is the Espionage Act, right? When you hear Espionage Act, right, it sounds like, wow, this isn't about him handing over documents to a foreign power. That's what I think of when I think of espionage, right? Yeah, the act itself isn't written in a particularly specific way. There are issues with the way that this act is written. But when you just get down to the fundamentals, which is really, really sensitive documents, really important documents, not in a place where they ought to be, not being protected, being shown to somebody else, then the sort of espionage definition becomes less important than just recognizing he's saying this stuff, regardless of classification, was really important to the country, and it wasn't being protected. And that's what you need to know about the Espionage Act.
And then you add the layer of alleged obstruction and this conspiracy here where you have Jack Smith alleging that he said to his attorney at one point, suggesting, we should hide or destroy some of these documents. What if we don't play ball? What if we don't tell them we have them?
So that's counts 32 to 37, right? Counts 1 to 31 are with regard to this Espionage Act. That's 32 to 37. And I do think it's important to look at them together, because I think that without one, you might not have the other. Meaning, if these documents were just sort of technically classified documents that weren't that big a deal, I don't know that we'd see this case. Even with the obstruction, I don't know that we would see it. I think that they might have used their discretion and said, Yeah, I know. They're technically classified. Yes, he wasn't helpful. Yes, he didn't turn it over to the FBI. But I think it's the combination of the level of sensitivity of the documents and the conduct together they felt left them no choice.
That you believe Jack Smith really couldn't turn away.
Yeah, and look, and I think that the arguments that are being made by many of Donald Trump's supporters, which are kind of a mix of politics and law, some of them address real legal questions, but others simply seem to ignore what's actually in the indictment.
I mean, one of the challenges in this case is it does deal with highly classified information. So how do you present that information? You can't, you can't present classified information in an open courthouse. Their courtroom, they're going to have to find a way to declassify and still be able to explain to a jury what's at stake here. I mean, I think, one thing that is interesting, you mentioned all of the agencies, Dan mentioned all the agencies that are mentioned. The agency that stands out to me is the Department of Energy. Why is the Department of Energy in this? What documents are those? Department of Energy obviously oversees America's nuclear program. And nuclear secrets are inherently classified. It's actually the one area of classification the president doesn't have the power to declassify. It doesn't get any more sensitive to that. Donald Trump, you've heard him, David, talk about how much he knows about nuclear. I know nuclear. My Uncle John was at MIT, he says. It was described to me, this is a meeting that I knew about a long time ago in the White House. And the significance of it, I just thought it was just a crazy Trump story. But it was a meeting in the Oval Office with the National Security Team in 2019. The then Secretary of Defense was in there. Mattis, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in there. Dunford, and it was just a budget meeting for the Pentagon, and the issue of some issue with the nuclear program came up, and Trump started, I was told, going off. I know more about nuclear than all of you people. I know more than all you people combined. And it makes me wonder, why did he want those documents?
Well, one of the first things after he gave his inaugural speech in that interview at the White House when we were walking to the Oval Office was talking about the nuclear codes and whether or not he was comfortable with the weight of that part of the job. And he wanted to make it very clear to me.
From the beginning of the job.
From the very beginning.
Yes.
I want to bring in John Santucci because it's been about 10 minutes now that the former president has been inside the federal courthouse. We knew at the time that we would not see this play out in front of the cameras. There are no cameras in federal court. We know a lot about what is happening, though. But before we even get to that, John, the former president sent out a message as this was unfolding.
He posted on his social media platform just as the motorcade was rolling into that federal courthouse, David. He writes in part, this is one of the saddest days in the history of our country. And of course, his signature phrase of witch hunt, David. It's a long statement. We're only reading parts of it to our viewers. Our understanding right now is that most of the Trump team is hanging out in the motorcade. They are waiting. Most of them are not able to actually go into court with him. I'm told he's inside, as you just reported, and they believe there is some type of processing going on. We're not positive right now from our sources, Catherine Falders and I, if the processing has actually begun, but many people believing that that is what's happening right now. We'll update our viewers when we learn more.
I don't know if we can, our director, Dave DeStinti, if we could go full on this image of Donald Trump. This is one of the first images now to emerge of the motorcade making its way to the federal courthouse. Donald Trump obviously gesturing to the people who did gather there, though we know the numbers are not as large as he likely would have hoped to have seen. And they're mixed. We know there are people there who are both supportive of the former president and those who are there against the former president. And they're sort of commingling with the media landscape that has sort of cropped up over the last couple of days in anticipation of what we all know is history being made here in South Florida today. I wanted to ask Preet Bharara, if we could, again, former U.S. Attorney, SDNY, Southern District of New York, how significant, Preet, you believe it is that this is the venue here, that we are in South Florida and not in the District of Columbia?
So people have been speculating about that because a lot of the investigative process, some of the rulings in the case that allowed the admission of testimony and documents from Donald Trump's own lawyers, all of that litigation, or much of it, happened in D.C. And I think there's good reason to believe that you could have brought at least portions of the case in D.C., but you have a second defendant here, Walt Nauta, his valet, and I think most of his conduct took place in the Southern District of Florida. There may be other reasons why, as a legal matter, the government felt that it was best to bring it in the Southern District of Florida. And also, quite frankly, I don't know if this was part of their conscious thinking or not, allows them to forestall the objection that they tried to bring a case in a venue that might have had more anti-Trump folks on the jury or in the jury pool than pro-Trump folks. It'll be hard to argue in any way that Donald Trump was railroaded by some witch hunt if they bring the case, basically near his residence in the Southern District of Florida, and it's presided over by a judge he himself appointed, and who, as we've talked about already on the program, ruled in his favor, some think in a biased way. So at the end of the day, if they get a conviction, by playing by all the rules and also in ways and places and with personnel that are familiar with Trump and favorable to Trump, it's hard to complain.
Preet, thank you. We're going to come back to this point, how all of those calculations here, putting this in Southern Florida, perhaps with a jury pool that might be slightly more sympathetic to Donald Trump, and again, with a judge who has ruled in favor of Trump before, appointed by Trump, that doing this way could actually insulate the special counsel somewhat later on if the special counsel gets a conviction here, that this was done in a fair manner, as fair as possible. Again, we'll come back to that point because we're learning Donald Trump has now been booked officially. John Santucci.
David, we're learning from a law enforcement source that ABC News just spoke with that the booking process for former President Trump and his aide, Walt Nauta, was just completed at that federal courthouse. Our understanding, David, that within just a couple of minutes, it's expected that they could be entering that courtroom and proceedings could shortly begin before that magistrate judge.
Aaron Katursky on the ground there outside the federal courthouse. So take us through what's expected to play out on the 13th floor of that federal building.
As soon as the former president enters courtroom 3 on the 13th floor, he will stand before federal magistrate Jonathan Goodman. And it will be the second time in 2 months, David, that he is the one who is forced to stand when the judge enters the room, as opposed to the other way around, what he might have been accustomed to from his days as president. There, he will, it's expected, enter a plea of not guilty. And from there, the procedure is relatively quick, and it will touch off the beginning of what could be a very long prosecution. The initial appearance ordinarily may take a little bit longer to go through some preliminary information about the indictment, but because it had already been unsealed, he can dispense with all of that. As soon as he leaves court, he may well encounter this crowd of supporters and opponents who've been honking horns, blaring music, blowing whistles, and I'm just stunned, David, by the atmosphere outside versus the gravity of what's going on inside. And it's a process that the former president may encounter potentially twice more, because there are 2 more ongoing criminal investigations that may yet result in charges against the former president. In fact, even as the special counsel was and his team bringing the case here, other members of the special counsel's team are back in Washington taking testimony before a grand jury related to the January 6th investigation.
The unflappable Aaron Katursky, as always, competing against the horns and that carnival-like atmosphere he described earlier. Maybe they heard his reporting and wanted to make themselves known. Courtroom 3 there in the federal building. On the 13th floor, again, the federal magistrate Jonathan Goodman presiding over today. We know Aileen Cannon will take the case from here. She's been assigned to this, and as you heard Preet Bharara mentioning a moment ago, she is not only a judge who's been appointed by Donald Trump, but she has ruled along the way in cases affecting Donald Trump in recent months and in Trump's favor. And Dan Abrams, to this point that Preet was making, that potentially by doing this and by taking the case to Southern Florida. Go ahead, Mark. What we're seeing right here is a spokesperson for Donald Trump expected to take a position in front of the cameras. That's Mark Burstein, our producer, telling me that was about to happen. And if it does, we'll certainly go to her right away. Again, we're expecting to hear from a member of Trump's team here. Let's listen. I don't see her on frame.
Okay, everybody.
There she is. Let's listen.
20 seconds.
Come on, guys.
Shortly, Alina Habba, covering some points. Let's give them a round of applause.
signed the document that said that all classified documents have been turned over.
Go ahead, Kieran.
Unless you need criminal suspect.
We're going to go right on these
John
two
Carl, tell us
blocks.
a little
One
more
and two.
about who we're looking at here. She was involved in this case
Yeah,
as well.
in the white there, that's Alina Habba, one of Trump's lawyers, and she signed the document that said all the classified documents had been turned over before the warrant was executed at Mar-a-Lago.
What's this?
It's not about President Donald J. Trump, who is defiant. It is not about the Republican Party. It is not about the 2024 election. It is about the destruction of the long-standing American principles that have set this country apart for so long. In recent years, we have seen the rise of politically motivated prosecutors who don't care for impartiality, who don't care for due process or equal protection of laws. They have been quietly but aggressively cultivating a two-tiered system of justice where selective treatment is the norm. From the Russia hoax to the attorney generals to the corrupt DAs in Georgia and New York, and now this. The people in charge of this country do not love America. They hate Donald Trump. What we are witnessing today is the blatant and unapologetic weaponization of the criminal justice system. The Biden-appointed special counsel has sought fit to bring 37 federal charges against President Trump, the leading frontrunner, less than a year and a half before an election. Countless other individuals, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself, retained possession of classified documents yet have not been prosecuted. And none of them came into possession of those documents while they were president. None of them were president who, as the head and sole member of the executive branch, has the power to summarily declassify documents. The decision to pursue charges against President Trump while turning a blind eye to others is emblematic of the corruption that we have here. We are at a turning point in our nation's history. The targeting, prosecution of a leading political opponent is the type of thing you see in dictatorships like Cuba and Venezuela.
Alina Habba, spokesperson for President Trump, who is inside that federal courthouse, 13th floor, set to appear before a federal magistrate, and quite telling there, Dan. And you would expect, obviously, that there would be a public defense of a former president, especially now that he's running for the White House. And we'll get into all of that, the ramifications here. But we didn't hear one sort of answer there or defense of the actual charges in the indictment.
Right. It's just sort of broad attacks on the fact that this prosecution is occurring. And, you know, one of the common refrains has been, what about Joe Biden? What about Joe Biden's documents? Well, there is a special counsel who was appointed, who is a Republican, who was appointed by Donald Trump, Robert Hur, as a U.S. attorney. He is currently investigating Joe Biden. If the goal is make sure that there's equal justice, what you do is you appoint a special counsel for Joe Biden and you appoint a special counsel for Donald Trump. Now, some people thought that there shouldn't even be a special counsel for Biden because there wasn't enough evidence. But the Attorney General sort of went the extra mile and appointed a special counsel in that context. So that's one thing. The second thing that very few people talk about is this claim of the politicization of the Justice Department, that Attorney General Garland is sort of out to get Trump. This Department of Justice has stepped in on two cases over the objection of many on the left and defended Donald Trump. In the E. Jean Carroll case, the case of the woman who accused him of rape and defamation, this Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, stepped in to defend Donald Trump. And then in another case where two former FBI agents were fired after their text messages in the Mueller investigation, the Department of Justice again stepped in to protect Donald Trump from having to testify over the objection of the lawyers for Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, over the objection of many on the left. So This sort of broad, sweeping claim that from day one, this Department of Justice has been out to get Donald Trump just doesn't hold water. You can criticize the Department of Justice. You can say they make mistakes. You can even say you don't think these charges should have been brought. But that's very different from accusing the Department of Justice of purely having political motives.
And of being singularly focused on Donald Trump,
Correct.
because we know that, as you point out, special counsel is investigating Joe Biden, the current president, obviously, and the discovery of classified documents in his former office and at one of his homes as well. I want to bring in Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent, because this brings right to her reporting. And Mary, this White House has been loath to talk about this at all involving the former president, but they have gone so far as to point out they believe there is a clear dividing line, a clear differentiator here between these cases.
Yeah, this president and this White House really don't want anything to do with commenting on this indictment. Again, I can tell you the White House briefing is going on right now. And again, the press secretary is not answering any questions about this because they are well aware that the Trump team and Trump supporters are making this argument that this is all somehow politically motivated. This president has vowed to protect the independence of the Justice Department, and he simply doesn't want to say anything that could be seen as trying to call into question the integrity of this investigation or doing anything that could add fuel to the claims by Trump and his supporters. And they, of course, have gone really out of their way to note the differences between these cases, and they are stark. And most notably in how both Biden and Trump acted and responded when it was called to their attention that they were inappropriately holding on to these documents. Joe Biden says he was surprised to discover that he had these documents in his possession. He didn't know he had them, and that he immediately alerted authorities, invited them in to take a look around, and has been cooperating with authorities since then, has been cooperating with this investigation. That is a stark contrast, of course, to Donald Trump, who allegedly, as we have been discussing, willfully took these documents, concealed them from authorities, and then allegedly conspired to obstruct justice. David, those are charges that have not been levied against the current president.
Yeah, talking about willful intent. That's the allegation, and of course, Donald Trump will defend himself now at the federal level in a court of law over the next several months. The timeline of this certainly is not known. Mary, before I let you go, that even though the president just within the last couple of days said no comment, I will offer no comment on this indictment, the First Lady did overnight, and she made some headlines, and she was pretty frank about what she thought was the reaction among some of Donald Trump's supporters.
And David, this is notable because the First Lady is doing what the president isn't, of course. Now, she didn't weigh in on the specific charges. She didn't weigh in on Trump himself, but she is commenting on the political impact of all of this. She was speaking last night in New York at a closed-door fundraiser, and she told donors that she finds it a little shocking that Republicans don't seem to care about this indictment. She was referring and referencing some recent polling, and certainly our recent polling has shown that so far, at least, this indictment isn't really making a political dent when it comes to Trump's support and the support that he has from American voters and Republican voters. And that is what we are seeing, echoed out on the campaign trail largely by Republican rivals of Donald Trump's and certainly by Republican leaders up on the Hill. Although, David, it is notable we are starting to see some cracks out on the campaign trail. I'm thinking, of course, of Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, who just in the last 24 hours have been willing to criticize Trump or at least show more of an openness to criticizing Trump. So perhaps a sign here that we may see some changes in the coming days.
Yeah, that's a delicate dance now underway among the Republicans who want to beat Donald Trump to capture that Republican nomination. How far do they go? They certainly don't want to alienate Donald Trump's supporters in this country, but we saw the cracks begin. Nikki Haley, as you point out, Mary Bruce, Chris Christie overnight in that town hall, taking direct aim at Donald Trump. But perhaps most notable was his very loyal Attorney General Bill Barr for so many years in the Trump administration. Following the unsealing of the indictment, those cracks now forming among some of those who were among the closest members of Donald Trump's administration. And we all know that Bill Barr and that once unwavering loyalty to the former president. Bill Barr now calling the allegations in this indictment egregious obstruction, but he went even further, and I'll let his words speak for themselves. Take a listen to this.
If even half of it is true, then he's toast. I mean, it's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning. And this idea of presenting Trump as a victim here, a victim of a witch hunt, is ridiculous.
Preet Bharara, what do you make when you hear the former Attorney General who defended Donald Trump on so many occasions saying, if true, he's toast?
I think it's notable that he used a legal term of art, toast, which is not something you use in court. I think it's very significant. And the last part of what he said about the witch hunt, about it being ridiculous that this is a witch hunt, you know that from the facts of the case. I'll tell you from the beginning, there's no evidence or indication that anybody had any deep desire or wish to bring this case. At juncture after juncture after juncture, either with the archives, the National Archives, or with the FBI, Donald Trump and his team were given the opportunity again and again to be rid of this problem and simply return all documents with classified markings. And if they had done so, there would be no case. It's only after they exhausted their patience, not returning documents, lying about the documents, moving the documents, defying a subpoena with respect to the documents, then they had to do a search for the documents, continued defiance, and the discovery of this tape. They almost had no choice but to bring the case. But the idea that from the outset, there's some witch hunt with people at the Justice Department who are politically motivated, trying to get the former president, they wouldn't have been able to do any of that because Donald Trump had his own opportunities to get out of trouble, and he didn't do it.
Pete Barrara with us for our coverage today, former U.S. Attorney, SDNY, of course, Southern District of New York. And Preet makes that case stand that you and I were talking about a little earlier here, which is, at least on the surface here, in this indictment, there is so much evidence, and we'll hear Donald Trump's defense along the way here, but so much evidence, at least at the beginning of this case, as it unfolds before the American people, that it made it almost impossible, it would seem, for Jack Smith to look the other way.
Yeah, and that was the question, was what's the threshold? What's the standard? Do you apply a higher standard to the former president of the United States? I've always believed the answer should be yes. Many people would say, how dare you suggest that the former president of the United States should have a higher standard than anybody else? When you're talking about presidential records and documents, these are not issues that come up with anyone else. So I think you can apply a higher standard. And I think that they did apply a higher standard, which goes back to the thing we talked about before, which is the intersection of the sensitivity of the documents and the level of the obstruction coming together in a case like this. And this is why you are seeing people like Bill Barr. You are seeing many of the legal commentators who tend to be more pro-Trump coming out and saying, this is pretty bad when you read through this document because of the specifics that are in there. So the claims that you're hearing for now are going to be primarily political. I think the next step in the courtroom is going to be to try to keep evidence out, to challenge the search warrant, for example, to be able to try to exclude evidence from the case. That's not the same thing as saying didn't do it. That's saying let's not admit it into evidence. And so this is where that interesting mix of politics meets law comes into play.
And again, to your point, I remember sitting down with Mike Pence a few months back in his Indiana home, and all of the headlines about the Mar-a-Lago discovery, the classified documents, certainly in the news, I felt I had to ask him about it. And one of the things I asked Mike Pence was, as we sit here in your Indiana home, did you take any documents with you when he left the White House? And we just read his face. You remember the moment in the interview where he smiled for a moment and said no. And then he went on to say, I don't believe any president or leader of that stature should take classified documents with them. Now, I bring this up not because it's my interview, but because a short time after we learned there were documents in that Indiana home, and Mike Pence came out and said it was wrong, it was a mistake. I turned them over as soon as we discovered this. And again, that's President Biden's defense right now, is that I also was not aware, turned them over right away when I discovered these documents. Again, this is very different what's been laid out by Jack Smith.
As a legal matter, we don't charge people for making a mistake when it comes to taking home a document. The goal is not to punish people for a mistake. The question becomes, when does it develop that corrupt intent, is the broadest way to describe it. That was the challenge in the Hillary Clinton investigation. That is what James Comey was struggling with. Do we believe that she or her allies or the people around her had the intent to try to hide the documents? Yes, there were documents. There were emails that were destroyed. No doubt about it. There was a phone that was destroyed. And some people say, well, that in and of itself should say, well, that's the same thing. No. They investigated and did not believe that the intention was to hide it from federal investigators. They instead, this was a personal server, they're allowed to delete personal emails, etc. That was what, in the end, they concluded was the intention. So when you're talking about the law, what is going on in someone's mind is critical. Intention. And that's the key difference here between what we saw with Mike Pence, which was clearly no intention, and that's why he's not getting charged, versus this case, where it was clearly intended to hide it from federal prosecutors if everything in that indictment is true.
Let's bring in Terry Moran on this notion of intent, because it is significant, and it is, again, one of these lines in the sand here differentiating some of these cases, Terry.
Absolutely. It is the reason that Hillary Clinton, as you've been pointing out, wasn't charged in that case. It's because James Comey said in that statement just a few days before the election that may have helped elect Donald Trump. He said that all the cases that he had looked at where the Espionage Act, retention of classified material was involved, he saw a combination in those cases of clearly intentional and willful mishandling of information or vast quantities of materials exposed in such a way to support an inference of intentional misconduct or efforts to obstruct justice. We do not see those things here. And if you remember, Comey concluded by saying that no reasonable prosecutor would bring such a case. Trump didn't like that, if you recall. He wanted to lock her up. And he asked his hand-picked FBI director and his attorney general to take another look at the case, and they couldn't make a case, primarily because it wasn't willful, that there was no criminal intent there. And so the cases are different, but the president is a different person. No man is above the law or below it, but the president represents all the people, is the only officer of the government who does so, and through our history is treated differently of it. You know, look at how Gerald Ford anguished over pardoning President Nixon. He eventually decided to do so to spare the country the trauma that people are concerned about right now. I look at the people outside the courthouse there, the flags, the lock 'em up sign, the Trump banners, and one wonders just how representative they are of the 330 million other people who aren't in front of the courthouse. My hunch is that the country's still a law and order country. There'll be fierce partisans on the Republican side who won't accept any of this evidence, fierce partisans on the Democratic side who, you know, want to see him locked up for whatever. But most people are in the middle, and they'll listen to the evidence. The justice system here is being tested. The American people still have confidence in it, and those protesters, well, they look pretty calm, actually. If this were really about to ignite the kind of division that everybody's concerned about, and rightfully so, given who the president is, not just Donald Trump, but that national officer who carries the representation of all the people and the tradition of our country in that office, I think it would be a tenser scene outside that courthouse, but time will tell.
Yeah, so far, Terry, what we're seeing outside these live pictures, this is what you would hope it would be. Peaceful demonstration and really a representation there of people at both ends of the political spectrum in this country. I was struck by Alina Habba coming out before the cameras, speaking on Donald Trump's behalf as he's in the federal courthouse to face this indictment, this 37-count indictment against him. And one of the questions going into today, Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice correspondent, would be whether or not the special counsel, Jack Smith, would be in that courtroom himself.
David, I'm looking to see if he appears today. I have reason to believe that it's a possibility. He had considered, I believe, going down to support his staff who have been investigating the case. And also, if he does appear, it will be a clear signal that this is the case I brought. I'm willing to stand in the court as you're being processed and arraigned. The other thing that really strikes me, David, about this, we were talking about Bill Barr a moment ago. Bill Barr is an attorney general who has come full circle in this regard. He felt that Donald Trump was a victim in terms of how the investigation into Russia was launched. He was very skeptical of the intelligence community. He was very skeptical, quite frankly, of the FBI. So to see him now say Trump cannot be seen as a victim speaks to, in part, one particular notion I know of, having covered law enforcement for 30 years now. On the issue of national defense, on the issue of classified documents, they are extremely strict on this issue. They put people in jail all the time. There's an Air Force official who was recently convicted who's now facing years for taking classified documents home willfully. So this is an issue that they are extremely serious about, in part because it involves national security and national defense. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see Bill Barr be so strident about his position on this.
Well, it's extraordinary when you think Bill Barr was the Attorney General who was so critiqued by the left and by Democrats in the country who accused him of holding on to the findings of the Mueller report so that he could then define the narrative much more in favor of President Trump at the time. And now it's a former Attorney General, John Carl, who says, if true, if this indictment is true, he's toast.
I mean, look, Bill Barr is somebody who still talks about the Russia investigation as a hoax and a witch hunt. He echoes Donald Trump on that point, and he's been roundly criticized by Democrats for that. But it gives him some credibility with those that are rallying around Trump right now. This is not somebody who is inclined to go after Donald Trump. This is somebody who has defended him when many others refused to defend him. So it carries great weight. You know, we mentioned Jack Smith and whether or not he's at this case. One thing is, he's a busy guy. He's got another case he's investigating. I mean, the January 6th investigation is the other half of his brief here, and in some ways a more complicated and far-reaching investigation than this one. And don't forget, he is subpoenaed all the way up to the vice president, the former vice president, Mike Pence in that case. That case is still pending.
Very important to point out to people watching that there could still be more coming from this special counsel.
There could be a whole nother, I mean, he's got a massive investigation, like I said, bigger than this one that he's dealing with. And don't forget there's the investigation out of Georgia, Fulton County,
and that's
Georgia.
An investigation, the January 6th investigation, that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the classified documents. Meaning, you can say maybe it would have happened. But when the special counsel was appointed, it came in the wake of the classified documents issue.
Yep.
And up to that point, there was a serious reluctance on the part of the Department of Justice to move forward with anything January 6th related. It was this case that led to the special counsel broadening his scope, and as a result, you now have 2 investigations, 2 grand juries, and bigger problems.
And playing out against the backdrop of a presidential campaign. So one thing I keep coming back to that we've discussed, David, is how does the legal calendar correspond with the political calendar? We know the New York case, the Manhattan DA case, the trial date is set for March 24th. That's in the middle of the Republican primaries. When is this going to happen? We don't have dates yet. We know that Jack Smith has said he wants to move quickly. Presumably that would mean get to trial before the end of this year. Is that feasible? Can that happen? When does the January 6th play out? I mean, of all the things that are entirely unprecedented here, former president being convicted and all of that, the real thing is the fact that he is the leading candidate for the Republican Party in the upcoming election.
And David, the Attorney General took a lot of criticism. Merrick Garland took some criticism for not being seen as aggressive enough
for
on
holding
January
off.
6th.
For holding off, yeah.
For holding off. And the documents thing, I am really told by multiple sources, was the thing that they said we simply cannot look in the other direction. He's just made it too difficult to do that.
John Carl just made a point, Kate Shaw, that I want to take to you. He said, Jack Smith wants to move very quickly on this. But again, he's just part of the equation in that courtroom. You have Aileen Cannon, the judge. And you also have Donald Trump himself and his legal team. And the calculation that they will make, not the judge, but Donald Trump and his team, about how quick or how slowly they would like this to play out before the American people, particularly as he's running for re-election.
Yeah. Well, it seems pretty clear to me they're going to want this to play out as slowly as possible. They do not want to see a trial by the end of the year. I think they would prefer to slow walk this instead of the election. I mean, maybe I suppose if he's confident he can get an acquittal, but I imagine slow walking is going to be the strategy. And so here I think it's going to matter a lot, sort of how the kind of tempo and tenor of the Judge Cannon, not the judge we're going to have, who's presiding today, but who will actually preside over the trial. And she's going to have a lot of power, either to kind of acquiesce if Smith's team says we got to move this expeditiously, or to essentially allow Trump's team to really slow walk matters, take a lot of time with motions to get evidence thrown out, to argue that the conversations with Trump's lawyers should never have been part of this charging document. All of that is off limits. Some of the documents are improper. So you could see a lot of pretrial litigation along those lines, and Cannon's going to have a lot of control over the timeline. And there I think we'll see, John, you said earlier, we shouldn't have any doubt about her fairness or impartiality just because she was appointed by Trump. I think that's 100% correct. But I do think that there are some questions her prior conduct, not in this particular case, but a predecessor dispute where Trump filed a civil lawsuit trying to object to the FBI seizure of these documents. And her rulings in that case were really striking in how solicitous of and protective of the former president they were. And she was rebuked pretty sharply by a panel of the very conservative 11th Circuit. So I think that we're going to have to wait and see what her disposition is here. But a lot is going to turn on her when we're kind of trying to think about what the calendar might look like.
And you touched on this here a moment ago. In addition to the calendar, because she'll hear the case made by Jack Smith to move this along as quickly as possible so that the American people can then decide for themselves with whatever a jury finds in the end. You'll have Donald Trump's team, we presume here, that will make the case to move more slowly, right? And as he tries to get elected president for a second time. But in the middle there, as this plays out, she'll also play a major role, obviously, in deciding which evidence is presented to that jury.
Which evidence? And there are all these hard questions about classified information and how you try a case where these classified documents are so central. So there's a federal statute called the Classified Information Procedures Act that sets forth these procedures so that you can basically give defendants the right to see and respond to the documents, but also protect the secrets in those documents. And that's usually really time consuming. And so I gotta imagine that DOJ, these special counsel prosecutors, are trying to figure out if some of these documents could just be declassified so that you can sort of circumvent all of those complex procedures. They've got 31 documents, so maybe some of them they decide to abandon, or even if some get suppressed, they have a number they can still go forward with. But there's going to be a lot of activity around those questions, how you try this case in a way that protects national security, but also the constitutional right to mount a real defense.
You said something, Dan, while we were on the air last week that got a lot of attention. You said Donald Trump will clearly try to slow down the timeline here. He'll try to get elected president for a second time, and he'll make this go away.
Yeah, I mean, look, if this case isn't finished by the time that Donald Trump is elected, I don't think it's any question that he can figure out a way to make it go away. This federal case, as distinguished from New York and Georgia, which are state cases. And as a result, if you're Donald Trump, A, why do you want a public hearing, which is, a lot of it is going to be bad. I mean, even if he's got strong defenses, a lot of the allegations are going to be negative. They're going to be ugly and embarrassing. Why do you want that? And more importantly, why do you want to potentially leave it up to a jury as to whether he gets convicted when he could wait until the election, hope he gets elected, and then figure out a way to get rid of the case?
So is there really any debate about the timeline strategy on the side of Donald Trump here?
No, there's none. I mean, Donald Trump will say he wants to move this case as quickly as possible, right? That's not just Donald Trump. Defendants, their lawyers always claim, A, that their client wants to testify, and B, that they want to get the case to trial as quickly as possible. And a lot of the time, neither one are true. But you see it in case after case. So you're going to see him saying that he wants to have it quick, but there's no doubt that he's going to want to try and slow roll this. And that's where Kate's absolutely right, where the judge is going to have enormous power there. I mean, the judge doesn't actually decide the verdict, but as a legal matter, the judge could even dismiss the charges. The judge could at some point, the defense could say, we'd like to make a motion after the prosecution's evidence is in, and the judge can dismiss the case as a matter of law. So that's the sort of worst case scenario for Jack Smith. But up until that point, she's going to have enormous power, jury selection, deciding which jurors can make it onto the jury, which ones don't, the timing, which evidence comes in, which doesn't, a lot of critical issues.
You know, when we've covered Donald Trump long before he became president in this country, and he's famous for this in all of the legal threats and peril along the way, stall tactics, delaying. And again, we can't overstate that delaying in this case, in this particular case, is very, very significant. He faces the biggest legal peril of his life right now. That we're talking about potential prison time here, and we can get into the conversation about whether a Republican or even a Democratic president would pardon him one day, but I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. But of course, he would want to slow down this timeline and work even harder to become president again.
Right. He's a great litigant. I mean, he's been involved in a lot of litigation. He knows how to do this stuff. He's not a great client, but he's a great litigant. And so he knows this game, not necessarily with regard to criminal charges, but it's in the civil context. But I think he's going to be leading that effort to delay, because that delay is not just a legal decision. It goes back to Jonathan's point. It's an intersection of politics and law. He's got to think about, where are we going to be in the campaign? Is there any political advantage to having this out there. And I can't see a single political advantage to him in having this case tried before the election.
Preet, do you agree with that?
Yeah, completely, 100%. And further to what Dan has been saying, there may be all sorts of ideas that Donald Trump has in his head, including the idea with respect to any federal charges, the one that we are now talking about today, and maybe a future one with respect to January 6th, that he can appoint an attorney general and other leadership at the Department of Justice to reach down, and if the case is not yet concluded, get rid of the case. I mean, this is one of the criticisms that a lot of people made of Bill Barr with respect to the sentencing of Roger Stone and with respect to the involvement in the case with respect to that general, right? Just get a new person in charge to replace Merrick Garland and have that person do my bidding. And we know in a second Trump term, he's going to have all sorts of stooges at the heads of these agencies. And the other thing you might be thinking about, which I think is a long shot according to most legal experts, is maybe he becomes president and he thinks he can pardon himself. This issue came up from time to time and was speculated about when he was investigated previously, both with respect to Bob Mueller and some other instances. Most legal scholars think you can't self-pardon, but that's something in Donald Trump's head. So Dan is right. There are a number of ways that machinations in the head of Donald Trump and his legal team might be spinning to figure out how to get out of this bind, so long as you can delay enough to make that happen.
Preet, what do you know about Aileen Cannon, the judge in this case? And obviously, as we've been talking here at the desk about her outsized role in sort of controlling the timeline here. She'll hear cases made on each side here, but her decisions on whether to move quickly or not could determine the entire outcome of what this country then witnesses unfold.
Yeah, so her role is incredibly important. When I was the U.S. attorney and when I was a line assistant, the first question you asked after the grand jury returned an indictment was, who's the judge? And judges are not fungible, and they have different viewpoints. They have different feelings about how evidence should be admitted. They have great control over trials in their courtrooms. Some are more permissive in what kind of evidence they allow in. Some are less. Some move speedily. Some move more slowly. All of those things have great bearing here for the reasons we've been discussing. She may be chastened in some ways because of the shutdown by the 11th Circuit, the conservative 11th Circuit, based on some of the things she's done previously, as Kate was talking about. So there's reason to believe she's going to be probably more deliberate and careful on the motions that'll be made and the applications that'll be made by both parties. But it remains to be seen how she's going to conduct herself in this case. She's not been on the bench that long, so there's not a super long track record to examine and make predictions about.
Preet Bharara with us for our coverage here. You're watching ABC News Live coverage here today of something, and it seems like we say this often, but today we really mean it. This is something this country has not seen before. A former president indicted on federal criminal charges. Again, 37 counts. He is inside that courthouse, inside that building, and we have just learned from our team inside the courtroom that he, as of 2:45 here, just a couple of minutes ago, now in the courtroom in front of that federal magistrate judge, Jonathan Goodman, who is presiding over today's proceedings, if you will. Aileen Cannon will then take the case from here. We've been talking a lot about her outsized role in determining how this case proceeds and where it might go from here. But we do know that Donald Trump is inside that courtroom with lawyers on each side, and I presume that is the legal team right now. The two lawyers that we spoke of earlier, John Santucci, you were reporting, as was other members of our team, that last night in the 11th hour, Donald Trump was still working to beef up his legal team here.
Still working to beef up the team, David, continuing those conversations today before heading to court. No full legal team set, so relying on these two attorneys who have been by his side for the last about a year, give or take, in each of their cases. Todd Blanche, who has come in rather late to Team Trump. He was elevated to the lead role on the Manhattan DA's probe. That's the one, the hush money payments to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. And then Chris Kise, who's a known Florida attorney. And that was really important, David, in order to actually be at the table today. We needed one member of Team Trump to be barred by the State Florida Bar Association, and Kise indeed is. Kise, at the moment, besides this case, is working on the New York Attorney General's probe into Trump's failure to pay taxes, both for him as an individual and the Trump organization. The goal, though, I'm told, is to expand this team quite significantly, because I think Dan noted this earlier. There really does need to be a team here. There is a lot of information that is known but also unknown. We need to see a little bit more of what Jack Smith has. That indictment, all 49 pages of it, certainly revealing. But the big concern I heard from Team Trump, and a question actually the former president was asking people as he was calling advisors throughout the weekend, what else do you think they have?
John Santucci reporting on the two lawyers in that room today, Todd Blanche, Chris Kise, and making a very valid point that the American people should keep in mind that both of these lawyers are currently heavily involved in other cases that are playing themselves out in court right now for the former president. Now they add this case, which is his most significant legal hurdle that he faces, not just in this chapter, but really in his lifetime. 37 federal criminal counts today in court. Again, now 250. We know for about 5 minutes now the former president has been in that courtroom. We knew all along that there would not be cameras. This is federal court that we're talking about. We knew that the process might move along a little more quickly than what we witnessed in Lower Manhattan, simply because Donald Trump and his team, though it's still ever-changing here, the legal team, did get a chance to read that 49-page indictment well in advance, along with the rest of the American people. The speaking indictment that we have talked about, that Jack Smith put out before the American people late last week. He actually invited the American people to read that indictment, saying that he hoped the American people, no matter where they come to, from which end of the political spectrum, that they'll understand the gravity, was his word, that he used to describe what he believes he and his team found in their investigation of the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And again, we've been talking at length here in our coverage about how this case is different from the others, and there ought to be a lot of questions about the other cases involving classified documents. Folks at home are smart to ask those questions, but there are a number of key sort of differentiations here between this case and the others, and they all can be argued. But in this particular case, what Jack Smith is saying is that not only did he have classified documents, but that there were multiple opportunities given to the former president, turn those documents back to the National Archives, back over to federal authorities. And Jack Smith alleges that not only did he not do that, but that he was involved in suggesting at one point or another to a lawyer to hide or destroy them, that they were placed all throughout Mar-a-Lago. And we've talked to John Carl extensively, who's been to Mar-a-Lago a number of times to interview the former president, found in the bathroom, the shower, the ballroom, in a number of places, and that there is a recording that Jack Smith has as part of this investigation, during which Donald Trump, and of course this is part of the indictment, Donald Trump will, of course, defend himself in criminal court. He has said, I am not guilty. I did nothing wrong here. But there is a recording during which Donald Trump can be heard saying in so many words that I have this document here. He's describing a document saying, I could have declassified it as president. I didn't, and I cannot do it now. And Jack Smith's argument and his team, their argument in that courtroom and before a jury, if it makes it that far, would be therein lies sort of the argument here that Donald Trump was aware of the stakes, of the rules, and how classified information should be handled. Now, what you're looking at right now are live pictures of the protesters who have gathered there today, and we should take note that there are people there flying Trump flags, supporting the former president. There are also those there saying, lock him up. You see right there in the foreground, a sort of split turnout today. We know that the former president in recent days has asked his supporters to turn out in South Florida to protest what he has repeatedly called a witch hunt before the American people. We took note a short time ago when Alina Habba came forward before the cameras, acting as a spokesperson on this day of history for Donald Trump, and turning to that familiar language, a witch hunt, turning to Joe Biden, to Hillary Clinton, to other cases involving classified documents. And of course, we played some of that for you, as the former president should be allowed to make his defense. But we also took note that in at least that moment, and we'll wait and see how this plays out, but in that moment, there was no defense of what is included in these 49 pages, this indictment from Jack Smith. And of course, we'll wait to see how the lawyers defend the former president once that legal team is put in place. But I think this notion that Todd Blanche and Chris Kise, Kate Shaw, are standing on each side of the president, the former president, at this hour in South Florida, and that they're already deeply involved in trying to defend Donald Trump in two other cases playing out. And we know there are a multitude of cases that still we don't know where they're going to go. The January 6th investigation, and also we haven't mentioned here at the table the Georgia investigation, where there's the telephone call and Donald Trump says, I just need 11,000 some odd votes here. help me out. We don't know where they're going to go in the state of Georgia, though we expect those developments could come in the coming weeks, certainly this summer as well.
That's right. The Fulton County prosecutor has basically suggested that July or August, we could see additional charges out of her office. And again, that also involves, efforts essentially to overturn the Georgia presidential election. So a distinct set of charges, state charges like the Manhattan case, so not charges that Trump would be in a position to do anything about, right, if he did manage to attain the presidency again. But I do think that 2 ongoing criminal cases, 2 potential additional criminal cases, it really is striking how small the legal team is right now, given the enormous range of sort of legal jeopardy that the former president is in. And, as John Santucci was reporting, it sounds like there is an active effort to get more lawyers on board. And the fact that there aren't more, I think, seems to suggest that it's not going well, right? The team is having a hard time securing additional counsel. And honestly, when you read the indictment, one potential reason might be that the lawyers surrounding the former president themselves are potentially ending up in legal jeopardy, right? So you actually have the former president saying to one of his lawyers, just identified as attorney number 1, but seems pretty clearly to have been Evan Corcoran, a former lawyer. Basically, can we ignore the subpoena? Can we say we don't have anything? Later, after some documents are nevertheless located by Corcoran, Trump saying, essentially suggesting maybe plucking some documents out, not explicitly directing destruction, but seeming to hint at it, according to the indictment. And, lawyers reading this, I think, might reasonably worry about what they are exposing themselves to if they join this legal team. We don't know if that's why they're having trouble securing additional counsel, but certainly a possibility.
And John Santucci, I'm struck by something you reported here late last week, and you and I have talked about it off air here, which was the description you learned from your sources on the day Jack Smith came before the cameras. And I think that people in this country, whether you support Trump or whether you don't, people are just curious whether or not the former president knows the kind of legal peril in this moment. Does he recognize this is far different from all of the other legal hurdles that we have reported on in the past year?
He absolutely does, David. And I think in part, it's twofold for Trump on that Friday evening. He started to flip through that indictment in real time. And as I've reported, David, the photos, he was showing them to people saying, well, how did they get this? Who gave them this? Where did this come from? He made comments about the attorneys that he was paying, his team was paying. Why did they talk to them? I think all of that barrage of evidence that Special Counsel Jack Smith had pulled together, all of it weighing on Trump. We all know, being around Donald Trump, a phrase he often used is, what do you think? How is this playing for me? And many people struggling to say that this was good for Donald Trump. One aide telling me it was one of the toughest days they can recall working for the former president. I am told that he indeed watched Special Jack Smith's press conference, taking it all in rather silently. David, watching it all, it was just a matter of a couple of minutes, and then quickly getting back on the phones. Yet again, that question, what do you think? How does this play? How do we move this forward? And certainly, David, we know throughout the weekend he has been working the phones, asking that question, and as Kate just mentioned, as we've reported, trying to build out more lawyers because even he realizes he needs more help here.
John, we're getting new information as we speak. Thank you, John. Luke Brugman, who's in the courtroom, reporting that Donald Trump has not only been in the courtroom now for about 15 minutes before that federal magistrate, surrounded by 2 attorneys, one on each side of the former president, but at the other table are 2 federal prosecutors, and standing behind them, Pierre Thomas, is Jack Smith, the special counsel.
I had reasons to suspect that he would be there. This case is both personal and professional. Personal in the sense that the FBI agents and the prosecutors who worked on this case were under enormous pressure to do it by the book and to come back with facts that he could use in the case. So that's the personal part. Professional part is, I think it's important to him to send the signal to the troops. I'm with you all the way in a case that we've never seen before. I mean, the thing that's striking, we keep coming back to it, Dave. Donald Trump is the most unique criminal defendant in the history of the country, period. You saw traffic block several lanes, so his motorcade. Most criminal defendants don't go to court with a motorcade, All the system is designed to respect him, even as the case is trying to administer justice in a way that it would for anyone else. It's a fascinating thing we're watching unfold here. The special counsel knows that. His being there is in part to send a signal to all those involved that we've taken this dramatic step. We're going to do it by the book. And my presence here is to indicate that I'm in full support, because there are all kinds of issues about security for these people as well. They've been very direct with us in terms of not putting out the names of some of the investigators, not putting out names of some of the team members. This is all as serious as it gets.
So again, live coverage here at this hour. The former president in South Florida to answer the 37 counts, federal criminal charges. And we have just been told by our reporting team inside the courtroom that not only is the former president there, but Jack Smith, the special counsel, is there too. We know late last week when Jack Smith came before the American people to talk about this 49-page indictment, inviting the American people to read it in its totality. They worked, you could tell, at length to try to make this accessible for people, and not a lot of legal jargon in this indictment, to try to make the case, whether or not you buy into it or not, but at least put out there what they think is damning evidence. You could see the sort of the weight of what he was talking about. He said the gravity of this is laid out in these 49 pages, saying that the former president should be presumed innocent until proven guilty, making sure that the American people understood that he believes in one of the basic tenets of what we're watching unfold as well. But John Santucci, this is significant, this small detail out of the courtroom, the fact that the former president is now face-to-face with Jack Smith. And I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time they're in the room together, correct?
It is absolutely the first time they are in the room together. And you know Donald Trump right now, David. We know from that first court appearance he made in Manhattan, I'm sure he is sitting rather silently, but I know Donald Trump. He's looking at Jack Smith, probably giving him a head nod, probably trying to find a way to be a little charming in some respect. I can tell you that I know from interactions he had with the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, at first he tried that same tactic. That's the Donald Trump charm offense. We know that Donald Trump's first move is to try to be friendly, try to be cordial, even though he has attacked Jack Smith everywhere across social media and at the rallies. It doesn't matter. This is the different Donald Trump. I've often described Donald Trump as several different iterations. One is the brash person that we see out in front of the cameras at the podium, but the other is Donald Trump, the businessman. And I think right now, David, that is the guy that is in the courtroom, looking at Jack Smith, little head nod, hoping some way, maybe, they can form a connection. I don't think that's going to happen, though, David.
No, but you're right, John Santucci. We have all covered Donald Trump, and that is what he does. He does that, in a debate, whether it's a primary debate, a presidential debate. If you're the moderator, you'll get a head nod at the beginning of the debate.
Yep. I mean, he's called the guy deranged.
And he went after his wife, too.
And he went after his wife. I mean, it's been deeply personal the way he's gone after him. But, he went after the judge in New York before walking into that courtroom, and obviously went after Alvin Bragg and his team, and he was utterly silent when faced with them.
We've just learned, John, that Todd Blanche, again, the attorney on one side of Donald Trump, has entered a plea of not guilty. It was Todd Blanche who did it before the federal magistrate, Jonathan Goodman, in that courtroom. We know that the magistrate's handling today's proceedings, and we've talked an awful lot about it. Aileen Cannon, who will take the case from here, a Trump-appointed attorney there in South Florida. But back to this notion, this dynamic between Donald Trump and Jack Smith, and I don't want to belabor it, but I also don't want to diminish the moment. And Pierre, I mean, back during the Mueller investigation, for example, you didn't really see Bob Mueller, but the fact that Jack Smith is standing in that courtroom with Donald Trump signals what?
It's highly unusual. Bob Mueller did not appear at any of the major cases, as far as I can recall. Did not appear. He let the work be done in the court on his behalf. It's the equivalent. The special counsel in a case like this is operating with the power and the authority on some level of the attorney general. It would be like the attorney general, in a case that's brought against some major suspect, suddenly showing up in the court during a criminal trial. You occasionally see top-level officials maybe appear before the Supreme Court, but not in a circumstance like this. I think he's sending the signal again that this is a case that he has personally been involved in, that he's monitored it at every step. And as the young people say every now and then, man's got a little swag. Yeah. He walked into that press conference on Friday, and we were all waiting to see what's his demeanor. He's never been in a circumstance where millions of people are watching him as he's speaking, and he walked in there and he owned the moment, and he talked very straightforward. And I think it's not lost on him being in the same room with Donald Trump would send a message.
Yeah, and no question that Donald Trump, this is one of his skills, part of the skill set that Donald Trump brings to the table is he sizes up anyone that will be an opponent in some way, right? Somewhere along the way. And you can imagine that Donald Trump would have taken into account immediately, as soon as we learned it was Jack Smith, who Jack Smith is and what his experience is. And as you pointed out earlier, Jack Smith is not only a federal prosecutor, but he's tried crimes on the international level, war crimes.
Right. So, an incredibly experienced prosecutor. One thing that, since we learned that Smith is in the courtroom, I have been wondering is, will the team ask this magistrate judge to admonish the former president, the defendant, about his public statements, right? We already, as John just said, he has already disparaged and gone after Smith, his wife. Remember back in April when the arraignment before the Manhattan the Manhattan trial court judge Merchant happened, there was a request, and Merchant granted this request. He said, no divisive rhetoric, right? He sort of essentially, told the president, watch what you say on social media. And I'm very curious if we'll get a similar request today. It'll just, sort of feel different in that the main target of that, rhetoric will be in the courtroom too. So I'm curious if we will learn that such a request was made and what the magistrate judge will say in response.
So it's always a tough balance, right? A defendant should be able, in most cases, to say, I'm innocent, I think I was falsely charged, and even to impugn the credibility and the reputation of the prosecutor bringing the charges. Now, there are cases with gag orders where that is not allowed, but in most cases, the defendant is allowed to speak out. The question becomes, when does it reach that line where it's literally putting people at risk in a case like this? And it's a balance between typically the freedom of speech and the need to have a criminal trial proceed in an orderly and safe fashion.
Dan Abrams and Kate Shaw on this notion that Jack Smith, the special counsel who has been targeted in the public arena by Donald Trump, and not a surprise, and that anyone in a case generally goes after the prosecutor trying them, but not perhaps with this sort of megaphone and as personally. Olivia Rubin from our team reporting moments ago that inside that courtroom, it was Todd Blanche, the attorney to one side of the former president, who pleaded not guilty for the president, entered the not guilty plea, if you will, in that courtroom. And again, we've been painting the picture as we knew we would have to do for you because there are no cameras in federal court. Let's bring it to Aaron Katersky as to what plays out from here, Aaron. So now we know about the not guilty plea entered on behalf of the former president. We know Jack Smith is there. We know two of the attorneys who are right now fighting cases on Donald Trump's behalf in other venues, very different cases. Todd Blanche and Chris Keyes here are the two attorneys who showed up on his behalf here today. So at 7 minutes past 3 o'clock here in the afternoon, already well underway. And where does this go from here?
Shortly, we expect former President Trump to leave this courthouse after having pleaded not guilty to the 37 criminal counts at his arraignment. And he is expected to head off to New Jersey so he can address his supporters at his golf club in Bedminster, putting the prosecution as a focal point of his politics. He's still there, though, for the time being, in courtroom 3 on the 13th floor, confronted not only by Jack Smith, but by David Harbach, who's a member of the special counsel's team, who we saw in the days leading to the indictment, going into and out of the grand jury room. We also saw Jay Broad, who's in charge of the counterintelligence division at the Department of Justice, and he had been arguing in court during the course of the investigation to see if there had to be a special master appointed. So it's three people who are very familiar with the evidence sitting there at the prosecution table with former President Trump, who has now formally had a not guilty plea entered on his behalf, touching off what could be a long prosecution, David, complicated by the fact that it includes classified material. Whoever former President Trump chooses as his attorneys, at least one of them will no doubt need a security clearance. The judge will need a special briefing on handling classified material. And the discovery process, what evidence has to be turned over from the special counsel to Trump's legal team, is also a bit more complicated. And that will stretch this out maybe even longer than either side hopes.
Aaron, talk to us a little bit about the motorcade here, post-court appearance. It will take Donald Trump away from the federal courthouse back to where, and we do know that obviously the former president plans to be back here in the Northeast in New Jersey, shortly after World News Tonight, in fact, back in front of the cameras, moving on with his campaign. But in that interim window, just talk us through what we'll see here.
The former president motorcade was seen by our team driving into an underground garage, so we assume they'll come out the reverse, and then they're expected to make their way toward the Miami airport for the flight aboard the former president's private plane back to New Jersey. He is not expected to linger here in Florida very long. He may encounter some of these flag-waving supporters that are outside the courtroom and outside the courthouse on all sides, being kept at bay by a significant law enforcement presence. But otherwise, the former president intends to address his day in court with several hundred guests at his golf club in Bedminster, making a speech that will undoubtedly have the same political tones that his spokeswoman, Alina Habba, made on the courthouse steps.
Aaron, as we await the motorcade again, and we don't know how long, though it could, we presume, be a short time from now, describe again, if you would, the crowd there. Has it grown in size at all since you first began reporting a couple of hours ago? And is it still, sort of split down the middle?
It is split. There are people holding signs saying lock him up and other invective about former President Trump, but there are a lot of his flag-waving supporters all intermingling. And for a while, they were all getting along and seemingly discussing with each other. At times, it does get heated, and we've seen members of the Miami Police Department move in to try and step between factions. But for the most part, it has been peaceful, and that's what the Miami police had been predicting. They said they were taking this seriously, but they weren't anticipating any trouble because it wasn't the Miami way, is what the police chief said. Still, there had been calls to draw supporters here, and some of those invitations did echo the former president's rhetoric about the special counsel and the indictment, and that did raise some concern among law enforcement. So far peaceful, David, as the former president nears the end of his arraignment. But until he is at the end of this, until he walks out of this courthouse, he's still technically not free. He remains in FBI custody, not in handcuffs, but not free to go until the judge dismisses him.
Aaron Kotursky just outside the courthouse, and Aaron, you'll flag the camera just as soon as you see any movement there behind you. On the right-hand side of your screen, for those watching at home with all of us, is where we expect to see the motorcade emerge a short time from now. They went in through an underground parking area, which allowed them to bring the former president in to be processed and then brought up to that 13th floor courtroom. And Catherine Falders, one of the open questions going into today would be whether or not the former president would be processed before or after the hearing before this magistrate judge. And it's your understanding that he has already been processed.
Yeah, we're told he has already been processed. He was processed before heading up to that courtroom, and that processing did not include a mugshot, as we've been discussing. His fingerprints were taken digitally, so he was fingerprinted, but no mugshot, no handcuffs, David. He didn't have to empty his pockets in any way. That was one of the first things he did when arriving to this courthouse here. He then, of course, proceeded into this courtroom for the arraignment. So as we're looking at those photos right now, those aerial shots, you should see that motorcade leaving here, I would think, any minute from now.
Catherine, thank you. And Dan, you and I were talking about this. You don't want the American people to become sort of immune to this notion that you have helicopters in the sky tracking a motorcade, and now this is the second time we've watched this play out in a matter of weeks. You can't overstate the magnitude of the history we're witnessing here today.
Two separate venues. Inside the courtroom right now, I promise you, I've covered hundreds of cases, some of them the highest profile cases in the country. And inside the courtroom, it is solemn, it is quiet. There is a judge who is ensuring that the right person is speaking at the right time. There's no one talking over one another. And then outside the courtroom, you have this carnival-like atmosphere. We've seen it in a number of the highest profile cases around the country. A little different here because you've got the political passion going over it. But, I remember the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case, when the country was watching and waiting, and the supporters and the detractors came out outside the courtroom to protest and to share their views. We've seen it in a number of big, high-profile cases, but just remember, when people talk about what a carnival, a circus, That's not what it's like inside the courtroom right now. Very different than what you're seeing outside.
And the live coverage of it all that we're talking about and the point we were making is that I do think the vast majority of the American people, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, are not numb to the weight of what we're witnessing here together as a team.
Yeah, but I think Terry Moran is right, about the idea that the vast majority of people are not going to be the ones who are so furious at Donald Trump that they're going to go to the courthouse and demand that he be locked up, or they're going to go with their Trump flags to celebrate. The vast majority of Americans are going to say, what's in this indictment?
Right.
What do they got here? How does this compare to other cases? Is there a comparison to Hillary Clinton? Is it fair? Is it unfair? I think that's the way the vast majority of Americans are going to examine this, not, yelling or screaming. And by the way, they have every right to protest. I think what's terrific is that this has been done in exactly the way we would hope, which is they're speaking with words, with their proudly displaying their views, no violence and no issues at the courthouse.
And of course, always a concern about lone wolves, but no sign of that either today, which is really a relief. And I know that we've talked about this with Pierre and the team, that they were hoping that the prosecutions after January 6th would be a deterrence, and perhaps they have served in that fashion as well. Before we continue with that part of the conversation, I do want to bring in Olivia Rubin of our investigative team. She was inside the courthouse watching a direct feed from that room with Donald Trump and Jack Smith, both in that room for the first time, seeing each other eye to eye. And Olivia, take us through what you witnessed.
David, in that overflow room where the reporters were seated, there was a camera pointed directly on the former president's face as these proceedings got underway. And I do just want to take a minute to sort of describe his face to you. He had a frown on his face. He was slumped over in his chair. He at times had his arms in his lap. And it was not until the judge asked to arraign the former president that he actually sat up a bit. He crossed his arms. But David, his body language really told the story here of how the former president felt inside of that courtroom as he was arraigned, of course, not entering the plea on his own. He was actually looking down at the floor for most of the hearing. And I will also note, and this was something we spoke about last time as the former president was arraigned in New York, what was so striking here, David, was that the former president was actually brought into that courtroom early. You'll note it was about 2:45 that the feed came up and the former president was already seated at the defendant's table. His co-defendant, Walt Nauta, was already seated next to him. Special counsel Jack Smith was already seated in the courtroom just over the former president's shoulder. And the former president, David, had to sit and wait for over 10 minutes until that hearing got underway. And he was forced to just sit there, David, to wait for the judge to enter as a defendant in that courtroom.
Excellent reporting. Olivia Rubin, who was in that overflow room studying that camera, trained on the former president. Olivia, thank you. We'll come back to you shortly if events warrant. In the meantime, some new reporting from inside the federal courthouse there in South Florida at this hour. We know that the former president was not asked to surrender his passport, no limit on international travel, no limits on firearms. These are the kinds of questions that do come up when you're facing, federal crimes, though obviously a very different case when you're talking about a former president. So again, none of those things have been asked of the president. Now, the judge did indicate, the federal magistrate judge did indicate that Donald Trump can have no contact with witnesses in this case, only his counsel, to which it's our understanding that Todd Blanche, his attorney, pushed back on that point, asking the judge to reconsider. But the judge holding firm, at least for now, you are to have no contact with any witnesses in this case, which includes Mr. Nauta, the aide, who also faces one count in this federal indictment of helping, according to Jack Smith and his team, helping Donald Trump hide these documents and not turn them in. That's significant because this aide was seen with Donald Trump over the weekend, John.
Seen with Donald Trump over the weekend. He was by his side. They were out at a campaign event as Donald Trump was doing just that. And David, Nauta was in the motorcade today. He was at Doral today. He was part of those conversations as they tried to build out a Trump legal team. So I don't know how that's actually going to be quite possible. And, you mentioned there are reporting from Luke Brueggemann in the courtroom, not discussing with witnesses. again, we have to remember all the people that have been witnesses in this case. Most of Donald Trump's campaign team has been witnesses in this case. Recall, he is running for re-election. He interacts with these people all the time. Some of the lawyers have gone in. I know most of the people at the Trump Organization have gone in, which is the business he still runs. I wonder how that works. Is Donald Trump just, quite frankly, not going to talk to anybody? Because everybody in his orbit, David, I don't mean to be funny, but everybody in his orbit is a witness.
And it is a smaller circle that we're talking about in recent weeks. John Santucci, thank you. And I think this is even more nuanced than what we are just learning at this hour. Again, didn't have to surrender the passport, no limit on international travel, no limit on firearms. But when it comes to witnesses in this case, no contact with them except via counsel through his attorneys. We know the two that are in the room, and obviously the former president hopes to grow that legal team, was interviewing prospective lawyers, we're told, in the 11th hour yesterday on the eve of this really important and heavy day, not only in this country in this moment, but certainly for the former president. But again, John Santucci brings up the point, and with no intended humor there, how will this work? Because this circle, many of whom are still in the circle, who are also witnesses in this case, they have been interviewed by Jack Smith and this team in gathering the evidence that they believe spells out the case against Donald Trump. But again, John Carl, it got your attention too. No contact with witnesses except through counsel is our understanding as we're reporting it out. This could be a little different once we get everyone out of that courtroom, but that's how we understand it to be at this point.
I mean, not only Walt Nauta, who's been traveling with him and is as close an aide as there is. I mean, he's there wherever he goes. But Walt Nauta had a back and forth with another Trump employee. There's Trump employee number 1, Trump employee number 2. One of those was Nauta. The other is another very close personal aide of Donald Trump. He doesn't have a big staff with him when he is in Bedminster, New Jersey, where he's here during the summer, or when he is at Mar-a-Lago. It's actually a pretty close-knit group of people, and I truly wonder how that is going to work. This
could be the first motion, by the way, that they make in front of Judge Cannon.
Yeah.
This could be the first effort where the Trump team says, we need the judge. Because remember, this is just a magistrate judge who handles the very, very preliminary aspects of it. I wouldn't be surprised if the ruling is as sweeping as it sounds right now, which is literally can't communicate except via counsel with any witness. I wouldn't be surprised if they now try and take it to Judge Cannon.
Because, you know, he has a small group of staff now. This is not a big group. And basically, I think John is essentially right here. There's nobody that hasn't been a witness. I mean, these are the people that are with him in Mar-a-Lago. These are people that were involved in the moving of the documents. This is his legal team. This will be very challenging. The other thing that struck me about Olivia's reporting is the idea of Donald Trump having to sit around for 10 minutes. 10 minutes, count them out, for the judge to come in the courtroom for the proceeding. Donald Trump doesn't wait for anybody. You know, when he comes in the room, it happens. I mean, and also the contrast in the way he acts in that courtroom, which we saw the same thing in New York. A very somber Donald Trump, hunched over, saying very few words, speaking those words very quietly. And then we'll hear from him tonight, and it will be ranting about the witch hunt and going after, you know, Jack Smith, who he has called a deranged lunatic. Jack Smith was right there in the courtroom with him right there. It's a very different, he knows the seriousness of the proceedings, and it's very different from what you see outside the courtroom.
And support him or not, this country knows the facial expressions, the mannerisms, the physicality of a former president. And when you hear Olivia describe him, his arms in his lap, his head down, a grimace on his face, and allowing his attorney on one side of him to enter the plea for him. You know, Donald Trump isn't afraid of answering or being the one who projects in a room. But in this case, when you're facing a 37-count indictment, it's the attorney who said not guilty.
I mean, on social media, he does all caps, "I am an innocent man." And in the courtroom, his attorney answering the plea.
And David, you see it now playing out with the magistrate ruling. From the minute that Nauta was indicted, along with the former president, there will be pressure now put forth by the government to increasingly isolate him from Donald Trump. The notion is they will try to apply the pressure so that he will understand your freedom, yours, is on the line here. What you do for yourself is going to become important. You may have been the dutiful, aide, but now you're seeing this play out, and he will become increasingly isolated if this ruling holds up, because they're saying you can no longer communicate with this man because your testimony and your actions are intertwined. It's a conspiracy case that they brought. So I think that's something, the human nature here is that Mr. Nadeau is going to have to do some soul searching about all of this in terms of whether he's innocent and how he's going to go about protecting himself.
Again, just early details from Luke Brugman in the courtroom that apparently the judge has said no contact with witnesses except via counsel, obviously through the former president's attorneys, and that would certainly include Walt Nauta, the aide, who also faces one federal criminal count in that very courtroom as well, the same case. And as Pierre points out, if true, if this reporting bears out that this is in fact what the judge has asked of the Trump team in this case, the challenge of this, and John Carl talking about how the circle is much smaller around Donald Trump these days, that Mr. Nadeau was with the former president just this weekend as he continued to campaign and prepare for this day in South Florida before that judge.
Yeah, and we're not talking about a short period of time, right? It's not like we're talking about a week. We're talking about the entire time until the trial, in theory, which, as we just discussed a moment ago, could be in 2025. So the notion that he's not going to have contact with some of his closest aides, I would think if this ruling is as sweeping as it suggests, that it might get amended to allow him to have contact with at least critical people, maybe not with Nauta, but with others who are critical to his campaign, et cetera. It becomes too ripe a political argument to make that he's not allowed to have contact with. I mean, don't you agree? Or?
Which is why Todd Blanche fought back in the courtroom.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out, Dan, this is a magistrate judge. They can always be overruled by the district court judge who is going to preside. So I think your prediction that this will probably come up, at least, a request to amend or modify in some fashion this order. And, I guess I don't really have a sense from the order, at least what we know about it, any potential witness, sort of, was there more specificity about who was encompassed within that? And really, if it's any potential witness, to John's point, maybe that really is everyone in the Trump orbit. And it's something that I think as president and even as candidate, Donald Trump has always kind of done, which is sort of collapse the worlds of the kind of presidency, the political office, and the personal. So obviously retaining his personal business interests, holding the RNC at the White House. There's countless examples of kind of commingling those two. And the fact that the witnesses are also his kind of friends and advisors, there's no real separation in some ways in Trump world, I think, between the official and the personal, which maybe makes an order like this really hard to see enforcing without truly isolating this individual, which maybe the judge would think goes too far.
I want to bring in Aaron Kaczynski into the conversation, our senior investigative reporter outside the courthouse. What have you learned, Aaron?
Well, one of the things we've been talking about, David, is the presence of the former president's legal team who's ultimately going to represent him. And at one point during the arraignment, the magistrate judge, Jonathan Goodman, asked Todd Blanche and Chris Kise, who were seated with former President Trump, whether they were the permanent attorneys. And they indicated they were permanent attorneys of former President Trump, but they had also thanked the judge for allowing them to appear. And the magistrate said, well, it wasn't his decision. It was a decision made by Judge Aileen Cannon, to whom the case has been randomly assigned. So she is already issuing rulings as part of her duties overseeing the case. But for the purposes of this particular hearing, Blanche and Kise were the attorneys. We'll see how that changes going forward as the former president alters and adjusts his legal defense.
Preet Bharara, what do you make of that?
Look, I think they're stalling for time. Todd Blanche, as I said, is a very capable lawyer. I've known him for 23 years. But when you have not just this case, which is going to be complicated, they're going to be complicated national security issues that come up with the Classified Information Procedures Act. You have him also at the lead and at the helm of the Manhattan DA's case in Manhattan. There's a potential new case we've been discussing for the last couple of hours out of Georgia, yet another case that might come from Jack Smith. For any one of these individual matters, even for an ordinary citizen, much less the former president of the United States, who has maybe other motions and legal angles he can pursue, you need a team of lawyers for each one of these things. So I think it makes sense, given that Todd Blanche seems to have the trust of the former president on not one, but two criminal cases, that he will stay on and probably be at the helm in some way. But they're going to need backup and they're going to need reinforcements as well.
And Preet, take us through what you believe they were doing in thanking the federal magistrate judge for allowing them to be there today. And of course, he points out then it wasn't me who made that decision. It was Aileen Cannon.
Yeah, look, as a matter of course in federal courts, obviously people are admitted to particular states' bars. I'm a member of the New York State Bar. I presume Todd is also. He's not a member of the Florida State Bar. That doesn't matter as much for federal court, but you still need to be admitted to the particular district court. And since he's not admitted to the Southern District of Florida court, you have to get permission from the presiding judge to appear. It's mostly a matter of courtesy. I don't think there's anything controversial about letting him appear. Sometimes you make a formal motion called a pro hoc vice motion. I don't know if that was made or not. It sounds to me like they were just being courteous and polite to the judge.
Courteous and polite, we'd like to hear. But it also signals to Preet that this isn't a legal team that's firmly set.
No, not at all. And, you know, I don't know if it's the case that you have sort of a pyramid structure because there are multiple matters and multiple criminal exposures, 2 that have already come to pass and 2 more that may come to pass, and also civil liability and all sorts of other issues that remain and appeal from the E. Jean Carroll case. Does Donald Trump have a structure where he has 1 or 2 sort of consigliaries who he consults that oversee all of the things and make sure they're coordinated and make sure appropriate attention and allocation of resources is made to each of the various matters? Or do you have an independent team on each? It sounds like he's at this moment, but he's a fickle guy, and he's a fickle guy in particular with his attorneys, as we've seen over the last 8 years. Will Todd Blanche have that role or not? And it remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen indeed. Preet Bharara, thank you. I do want to bring viewers up to speed. 3:30 now here in the East, and you're looking at live pictures there from South Florida. We do know that the former president, Donald Trump, has been in that federal courthouse, and in particular in that courtroom on the 13th floor for about 45 minutes, 2:45. We have reporting from our team describing Donald Trump waiting for about 10 minutes for the federal magistrate judge to enter that courtroom. We know that it was Todd Blanche on one side of the former president, Chris Kise, the attorney on the other side of the president. It was Todd Blanche who entered the not guilty plea on behalf of the president. Our Olivia Rubin reporting from the overflow room. This is a room where they have a camera actually trained right on the former president, describing his demeanor, sort of a grimace on his face, looking down, his arms in his lap for a time. We also know, and we didn't know going into today, though Pierre Thomas and our team had a suspicion that Jack Smith would be in that courtroom today, and in fact he was. The special counsel showing up. So you had 2 federal prosecutors and then the special counsel, the head of the team, standing right behind them in that courtroom, sending a message. Pierre was suggesting not only to his team that has worked on this case, but also to the defendant, the former president, Donald Trump, that Jack Smith is not afraid of the evidence that he has put out before the American people, 49-page indictment, that he would show up in that courtroom too. But Pierre also reporting out that we very rarely saw Bob Mueller. So it's not typical that you would necessarily see the special counsel show up, particularly on day 1 for an appearance before the federal magistrate judge, not even the judge who will preside over the rest of this case, Aileen Cannon, as it moves forward. We did get a hint there, though, of her involvement in this case already at the end of the proceeding of the plea, the not guilty plea that was entered on behalf of the president. The attorneys who were present, and again, this is a moving legal team, but Todd Blanche, Chris Kise were asked by the judge, are you permanent members of Donald Trump's legal team? They both answered yes, though still unclear to us whether that means permanent members of the team that will defend him in this particular case, because we know both of those attorneys are right now working other cases, other legal hurdles, challenges that the former president faces. Their answer was yes, and they thanked the judge, the federal magistrate judge, for allowing them to appear in court on Donald Trump's behalf. Preet Bharara saying just moments ago, suggesting those are general courtesies offered at a courtroom, but that perhaps they were admitted into that courtroom even though they don't have access typically to those courtrooms in South Florida. Donald Trump is going to have to expand his legal team to have local representation as well, but that was a decision made by Aileen Cannon. That was the first signal to us, at least so far, of her involvement in this case. To bring you up to speed, and those of you who've been watching all afternoon, you know this, but moments ago we also learned that Donald Trump was processed, fingerprinted electronically in this day and age, not actually with the actual thumb down on the print pad. That was taken care of. No mugshot. Obviously, Donald Trump recognizable, not just in this country, around the world, the most recognized man in the world at this moment, perhaps. No need for the mugshot, they decided. He's been told he does not have to surrender his passport, no limit to international travel, no limit to firearms. And again, these are the kinds of issues that they take care of in these federal criminal cases right out of the gate on these first initial hearings. But this is the interesting piece of reporting that we got from our team. And again, this is early, so we'll learn much more about this as the day wears on here. But initially, the judge has said to Donald Trump, the former president, obviously, and his legal team, no contact with witnesses in this case about the case unless it's via the counsel. So he can speak with them, but again, who decides that? And I have my producer in my ear.
About the case?
About the case.
Okay, well, that's a little different.
But who's going to watch when he talks to Walt Nauta to say, oh, you're talking about the case versus not the case?
No one. But there's a big difference between you can't talk about the case with witnesses and you can't have any contact with witnesses. Because there are cases where you would tell the defendant, you simply cannot have contact with any possible witnesses in this case. It makes a lot more sense that the order would be, you can't have any contact with witnesses about the case. And then the only way there would be action taken would be if there was proof that somehow it had been violated. Very different issue. Can't have contact about the case, because then he can still have contact with them, he can still work with them, he can still talk to them, he can still campaign with them.
You're right. This clarification coming in again, and it's a clarification. It's more, and we knew this was going to be more nuanced once we learn more. Again, no contact about the case with any witnesses for the former president unless it's via counsel. Okay. So having said that, Dan and John, you know from covering Donald Trump for years, and everybody at this table, that still will be an enormous challenge for the former president, because when you're in the room with him, you know, nothing is off limits.
And there's never a filter with Donald Trump. So it's almost impossible. This is all he's been talking about to anybody that's around him. I mean, I've talked to, you know, some of his senior political advisors as they've tried to come up with a campaign strategy for this upcoming campaign, and tried to get him to talk about, you know, some of the issues and ways to attack Joe Biden, et cetera. He always comes back to these cases. He is obsessed with portraying himself as a victim of a witch hunt, of a hoax, of talking about his campaign as being retribution for the way in which his enemies have gone after him using the criminal justice system, telling his supporters they're coming after me because the real target is you. So the idea that he will not talk about this case to anybody around him, it's a little bit of a stretch. That's what he's talking about to everybody.
Which is probably why Todd Blanche said to the judge, let us try to ask you to reconsider in that courtroom. 328, a short time ago, we're now told 328, the former president has signed conditions of his release. And of course, the conditions include what we've been talking about here at the desk, which, even though more nuanced, will still be a challenge for the former president. What he's been told by the judge is no contact with witnesses in this case, about this case, unless it's through his lawyers. And here's the challenge, and John Santucci has reported on this, John Karl has reported on this, that the circle around Donald Trump is a very tight circle, and it's a bit smaller, certainly than it was during the presidency, but much smaller over the course of these investigations that are all happening on sort of parallel tracks here. So it will be a real challenge when you think Walt Nauta was just with Donald Trump over the weekend leading up to today's appearance on campaign stops, when Walt Nauta is facing one federal criminal count here as well.
At his side, I mean, literally handing the pen to him when he's signing autographs. He's with him basically wherever he goes. And Donald Trump, I mean, you see Donald Trump on the campaign trail. We'll see him tonight. He's going to be talking what? He's going to be talking about this. He's going to be talking about this, putting it in the context of his campaign. And as we were saying, I mean, this is...
What if one of the witnesses are in the audience tonight? Does that count?
Right.
Does that count as
talking? This is going to be a very tough thing, and the enforcement of it.
Yeah.
Well, let's just ask John Santucci. John, we've all been reporters in Trump world on the campaign trail and then during the presidency. You know, how does he even get on the plane today?
Well, David, I was just going to say, Dan, I give you credit. You think tonight? Wait until he walks up onto the plane. That's when the first violation might just occur, because he's going to be on there. We know Donald Trump. John, David, we've all been on that plane. He's going to be watching cable news coverage. He's going to turn around to every one of his campaign advisors, all of whom are also witnesses. Many have gone in to the grand jury on this case, and he's going to talk about it. Donald Trump cannot help himself but talk about it. So I don't know who the self-policing is going to be around him, but no matter what, even when Donald Trump is alone. And John Carl, you'll remember this. It was always the last person that spoke to him at night at the White House, because Donald Trump is always working the phone. He is always seeking out somebody's opinion on things. And obviously with this, he's going to do it. Look, Dan mentioned Bedminster. There are over 600 people going to Bedminster tonight. This was a pre-planned donor event. He's going to be talking to people tonight. They're going to be asking him what he thinks about the case. He's going to be talking to them, asking what they thought about it. And I'll bet you many of those people are witnesses.
Preet Bharara, what do you make of the judge saying no contact with witnesses except through your counsel if it comes to a conversation about the case?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about it for the last few minutes from the perspective of Donald Trump's own lawyers. Now, one of the challenges if you're Donald Trump's lawyer is to maintain control, understand all the facts, understand and be able to be sort of supervising the kind of contacts that your client has, who he talks to, what he talks about. And you might make the argument that Donald Trump's own lawyers might say to him behind closed doors, we don't want you to be talking to any witnesses about the case. And frankly, we don't want you to talk to any witnesses at all because we don't, because they might not trust him not to talk about the case. And if that's your position, that all Donald Trump can do is harm himself and get in trouble and trip the wire because the admonition is not to talk about the case, but you can talk to them, knowing that he doesn't have self-control and knowing that he has a big mouth. They don't want him to be in a position of violating a court order. So from their perspective, I think it's possible that they think, not that they want to modify it, or maybe they want to do that to show, President Trump that they have his back, but they might be of the view that they've been given a little bit of a favor so that they can argue, because the judge says you can't have these kinds of conversations, you just can't do it. And that allows them not to be in the position of having to defend something of a violation of the court's order.
And Preet, if you're Walt Nauta and you hear that the former president has been told not to talk with witnesses about this case, and your own future is being debated in federal court, what does he face here?
Well, the interesting question we haven't really talked about at length with respect to Walt Nauta is he in a position to, or does he have any inclination to become a witness against Donald Trump? In the ordinary course, you have a big fish and you have a smaller fish, and here the delta between the big fish and the small fish is quite large. Although Donald Trump is facing more counts and more jail time, we know from reporting that the prosecutors wanted to get Walt Nauta to flip and be a cooperating witness against Donald Trump. He would provide significant testimony with respect to some of the obstruction counts. We also know that there's an allegation from the Trump team and the Nauta team about the inappropriateness of how that pitch was made, and reference that was made with respect to Walt Nauta's lawyer. But the fact that he did not cooperate in advance of the indictment, not always, but generally means that he's deliberated over it. He's done the cost-benefit analysis, the risk analysis, and decided he'd rather go to trial than cross his boss or former boss and testify. Sometimes in the light of day, when you see the actual charges in print and you get arraigned before a federal magistrate judge, the calculation changes because you don't want to go to prison. You decide to flip. So the jury's out on that, but I think we don't know what's going to happen there, and that's an important, I think, missing piece with respect to the prosecutor's case, whether Walt Nauta flips or not at some point in the future.
Powerful juxtaposition here, Preet. Just to the right of the screen, we were just looking at images of the former president and Walt Nauta, again, by his side in recent days after the 49-page indictment was made public before the country, stood by his former boss, continues to stand by him. But as you point out, the question now becomes his own legal calculation, particularly given what the magistrate judge has asked for today, that there be no contact, at least about the case. Now, who tracks that and then how that, plays out in court will be the real challenge, Kate.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think the responsibility at this point lies with Trump's lawyers, right? They were in court. They are officers of the court. They know what this order says. And to John's point, so maybe, there's no policing Trump's own compliance with this order, or it would be almost impossible to do that. But I think they could probably reach out to the other parties and, advise all of them. If he starts talking to you about something related to this case, you got to cut it off, right? So I think actually really lawyering this case in a responsible and ethical way actually does mandate them seeking to enforce the conditions of this order.
I think really interesting. Preet makes a point that maybe he was helping the judges in that the lawyers in that courtroom.
Absolutely, and so but now the lawyers, I think the responsibility lies with them. They're going to have to be really proactive if there's any hope of this order meaningfully being enforced.
That's another reason to not want to be a lawyer involved in this case. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine having to be the enforcer? I mean, John Carl can probably talk to you about that more, but having to be the one who is saying to Donald Trump and the people around him, hey, not allowed to do that. I mean, that's not a position that anyone would envy.
No.
You're looking at live pictures. We're expecting the motorcade now to emerge at any moment back from underground, that federal courthouse in South Florida. Again, this is the venue where this case will play out before Aileen Cannon, who was Trump-appointed judge in that district. She made some headlines for herself because of a ruling in a separate case, but a ruling that was favorable to Donald Trump. And we also know that they could have made the case that this play out in the District of Columbia, that perhaps this was all part of strategy to try to avoid any kind of appeal or questioning of the case much further down the road for the special counsel, that perhaps Jack Smith believes, and you would think he does, Pierre Thomas, given the 49-page indictment, the fact that he's standing there in South Florida today in that courtroom, that to move forward in South Florida might insulate them from the critique that will, in fact, come, certainly if there's an outcome in their favor.
Clearly, there's some risk in doing it this way. Obviously, I was speaking to several former federal prosecutors. They said, look, you go where you can get the conviction easiest. Typically, that's part of the mandate is to win. But in this case, they're trying to do everything literally by the book. And the majority of the alleged criminal activity took place regarding the obstruction in Florida. And they think it fair to do it there. And I'm told at the end of the day, that's the route they took.
Not concerned about the jury pool?
They think that the case is compelling enough and persuasive enough that they can win anywhere. But again, you won't know until the trial takes place. And particularly, again, going back to the evidence, there's allegedly evidence of Mr. Nada going in and taking the documents. Okay.
Peter, we're just learning from that courthouse. Forgive me for interrupting for just a moment. 3:43, just 2 minutes ago, 3 minutes ago here in the East, as we're all watching this unfold, really across the country. But about 3 minutes ago, the hearing was gavelled out of order. They've now left the courtroom. Walt Nada did not enter a plea today because he didn't have local representation in that courtroom. That's our understanding right now. So no plea from Walt Nada. He's been asked to come back to federal court on June 27th. So just a few weeks' time from now, Walt Nada will be back before, and it's not clear that it'll be the same federal magistrate. But again, no plea from Walt Nada. They have gavelled out at 3:43, which means the former president was in that courtroom for about an hour. And again, the reporting from our team that was witnessing this, right next to that courtroom, the overflow room where they have cameras trained, particularly on the former president, that he waited about 10 minutes for the federal magistrate judge to come into that courtroom, looking down for a time, his arms in his lap for a time. What we learned today was that Jack Smith was also standing right there in that courtroom, the special counsel. And we all know from reporting Donald Trump and in this country from watching him as the president for those 4 years that he does size up opponents, whether they're political or otherwise. And certainly our reporters made that observation today, that he was very likely sizing up Jack Smith, the special counsel who came before the American people in a rare public appearance on Friday before the cameras, saying to the nation that this 49-page indictment has now been made public, inviting the nation to read it and understand the gravity of the evidence that he says he and his team put together in this case. Again, live pictures from WPLG right there. The motorcade expected to be seen again at any time. It's underneath the building, as we've been saying. Donald Trump, for the better part of an hour now, though it's our understanding that they've now left the courtroom on the 13th floor of that courthouse in South Florida, where he answered to the charges. It was 3:28, 20 minutes ago now, that he signed the conditions of his release, which will be debated in the days and weeks to come about how that will be enforced. But apparently the judge asking that the former president not have communication with witnesses in the case about this case, unless it's through the former president's legal counsel. That will be a challenge to not only track, but then also argue in court if you believe you have evidence that those conversations have played out. But again, the president has signed those conditions of his release, which also includes no turning over of the passport, no limits on international travel, which we didn't think was going to happen either of those cases. It's our belief now that Donald Trump will quickly make his way back to the plane. He'll fly back to the Northeast tonight. He'll appear at Bedminster in New Jersey. He'll hold a political rally. And, you know, there was a little bit of, I detected a little bit of humor, Dan Abrams, but you were saying what happens when he talks to this room at Bedminster, because his supporters include a lot of the witnesses in this case. I think John Santucci actually alluded to that. But this will be a challenge moving forward because, again, it's a very tight circle around Donald Trump, and it has been sweeping the nature and scope of the number of people who are in his orbit who Jack Smith and this team have brought in on this investigation.
Right. Look, I don't think it'll count if it's someone who's actually in the audience.
I didn't think that you would. Yeah.
But no, look, it comes back to actually some of the same legal issues we've talked about before. Intent, right? We talk about intent broadly about this indictment. It'll come down to intent. Was there an actual intent to violate the order? Did they specifically have a conversation about the case, or was it just some passing reference, et cetera? Look, I don't think this is going to be a significant issue because you're going to need someone reporting the violation. Right, you're going to need someone in the inner circle who's going to be going to the court and announcing that there has been a violation of the court's order. I don't expect that is going to happen, but if there's something flagrant about it, if there's something in the public eye that happens where he is clearly talking about the case to a critical witness, then it's possible that it gets reported to the court. But then again, Aileen Cannon steps in, and we'll see if this ruling even stands.
And I think what's most interesting about this ruling from our conversation here is just really keeping our eyes trained on Walt Nauta here and his own personal decisions on how much to protect himself moving forward. That I don't think that what played out in this courtroom is going to change the former president and his behavior, but whether you like it or not, but I do think Walt Nauta and his future steps here, at least in the immediate future, everyone will be reporting out whether or not he changes any of his decisions moving forward, given what played out in court today. Seeing a little bit of movement there on the street as we await to see the former president's motorcade leave the courthouse. And as we keep our camera trained on this, because we expect to see it at any moment, I do want to bring Rick Klein in on the conversation. He's our political director. And Rick, let me ask you how this changes, if anything, the race for president. At least at the outset here, he's going to be having a rally tonight. He'll be raising money on what transpired today. But again, for people at home who wonder, well, federally charged, 37 counts. What if there's a potential conviction down the road? Is there anything here that changes his course?
David, there's nothing in the Constitution or federal law that prevents him from running, even if he's under indictment, even if he is convicted and behind bars. There's even precedent for that more than 100 years ago for a presidential candidate campaigning from behind bars. But before we get to that, there are, of course, the practicalities of running for office. And as you've been discussing this afternoon, David, it's very hard to do both things at once. You've got a public demeanor, you have a private demeanor. I was talking to a Republican advisor to another candidate earlier today and said, look, why would you allow him to debate? Why would you allow him to go out there and campaign if he is indeed going to be held to account for anything that he says? He's going to be pressed by candidates. He's going to be pressed by interviewers. And look, this is not his first indictment, as we've discussed. 2 months ago, he got the indictment out of Manhattan. And since then, the polling average from our part is at 538. He has gone from leading Ron DeSantis by about 20 points to leading Ron DeSantis by about 30 points. So anyone who thinks this ends him politically, I don't think has been paying attention to the mood of the Republican electorate of late.
Tracking this camera, Rick Klein, our thanks to you, always here with us as well. And I want to bring in Rachel Scott, who was actually in the courtroom. Again, we've been describing, and this is the challenge in reporting out a federal criminal case with no cameras in the court. But there was the overflow room where several members of our team were watching the camera trained on the former president. And then there was obviously the courtroom itself, a much smaller group of people in that courtroom. We know the former president. We know the special counsel Jack Smith was there. And we know our Rachel Scott was in there, too. So, Rachel, just describe, if you will, what you witnessed transpire here this afternoon.
David, we were taken up to the 13th floor to enter that courtroom. I was part of a small group of initially 20 people, members of the public, as well as reporters, who were allowed to enter the courtroom for such a historic arraignment of the former president. Before the arraignment actually began, former President Donald Trump, seated at that defense table, at times appearing restless. He was twiddling his thumbs, his hands were crossed, his shoulders slunched over, his mood stern, at times stoic, but it was clear that he was ready to move forward and to move forward quickly. Walt Nauta, the co-defendant in this case, sitting just 2 chairs over. Trump did not utter a word throughout this entire proceeding, but he didn't necessarily have to. He appeared restless. Jack Smith, The special counsel sitting just on the other side of the former president in the first row, at times glancing toward him. The former president, from my view, never looked back. The judge asked at the beginning of this if Trump's two attorneys were there permanently or temporarily. We know that the former president has been meeting with new attorneys after two of his attorneys resigned just hours before that indictment was unsealed. Jack Smith glancing back at Trump at times, and his lawyer, especially when his lawyer said most certainly Trump pleads not guilty. Of course, the tension, as I'm sure many of our reporters have told you, came in the courtroom around who exactly Trump should have contact with. The judge laid out at first that Trump should have no contact with witnesses unless through counsel, no contact with the co-defendant in this case, but emphasizing that since Walt Nauta works for the former president, that he would only allow that to be contact about the facts of this case directly. Now, Trump's lawyers did make a very forceful argument inside, saying that that would be impossible because many of the witnesses or victims in this case could potentially be a lot of people that work for the former president. As we know, a lot of these classified documents were found at his Mar-a-Lago resort, in the bathroom, in the ballroom, in storage rooms. It was clear at one point that the former president was eager for this to end. When the bond was brought over for former President Donald Trump to sign it, he pulled a pen out of his jacket, signed it very quickly, his lawyers pouring through it. Well, turns out they skipped a couple of pages. That bond actually had to be brought back to that defense table 3 times, so much so that the judge remarked, "Third time's the charm." And then, of course, Walt Nauta not necessarily having a permanent legal defense team there today, and so he will not be arraigned for another 2 weeks. You know, David, sitting inside of that courtroom for such a historic arraignment today, I will tell you I was just struck by the number of Secret Service in the room, so much so that the first 2 rows behind the former president were completely empty. I was struck by the president's mood. Again, at times, his arms crossed for most of this arraignment. He leaned forward, he leaned back, only glancing at the prosecutors occasionally, but for the most part, his eyes were staring forward straight at the judge. And when his arms weren't crossed, he was hunched over the table. Shoulders were slumped. And David, of course, as we are covering this unprecedented arraignment, one thing that certainly sticks out here is the fact that the judge said the words former president before the criminal defendant's name. And of course, in this case, that is Donald Trump.
Rachel Scott, just emerging from that courtroom. We're watching the motorcade now leave federal court in South Florida. That motorcade beginning the journey back to the Northeast tonight, where the president plans to hold a rally. We suspect he will immediately begin to take aim at this investigation, and certainly the charges that he entered a not guilty plea to through his attorney, Mr. Blanche, a short time ago. Excellent reporting from Rachel Scott, and dare I say it shows that we were on the right track in our conversation up here, because even she described the confusion in that courtroom, the challenge, the initial challenge anyway, if you will, the federal magistrate asking that the former president have no contact with any witnesses in this case except through counsel. And then there was the back and forth, the asking for a clarification. The judge did clarify with reference to the case. So that doesn't preclude him from talking to witnesses about, say, other things like a race for the president, the White House, but does preclude him, at least for now, until they can, reconsider perhaps under Aileen Cannon when she takes the case from here. But at least for now, there appears to be in place some guardrails here for the former president, being told that he's not to have contact with witnesses in this case, about this case, unless it's through counsel. Rachel reporting out, and I thought this was pretty interesting because Rachel was sequestered, if you will, because she was inside that courtroom, could not leave until everyone left. And much of her color bears out with what our other reporters were offering to us from the overflow room. That this was a president who wanted this over with, this hearing over with. She talked about his shoulders being hunched over. Interestingly, and Rachel, if you can still hear me, I think this is interesting for our audience. Jack Smith, the special counsel, obviously in that courtroom. We weren't sure if that would happen today. Pierre suspected it would, and he did appear. You did not notice any. You saw Jack Smith looking at the former president, but you didn't see the former president looking back to him.
No, look, Jack Smith's presence was certainly known in that courtroom. Our eyes caught him, in fact, before we actually caught the former president sitting at the defense table. And while Jack Smith glared at the former president through much of this, the former president never once turned around. I did not spot him looking back at Jack Smith. The former president was allowed to exit first, and then Jack Smith and the prosecutors followed, David.
We know there's two federal prosecutors standing just before Jack Smith making the case before the federal magistrate judge. Did you see any contact between Smith and members of his team who took on the roles, at least in this initial hearing?
Towards the end, we definitely did. In the beginning, before this arraignment actually began, Jack Smith was just seated in the first row, his eyes just staring forward. It wasn't until it started getting underway that we started seeing him look at the former president. And then at the end, when the judge allowed everyone to leave, that's when we did see Jack Smith walk out of the room with the other prosecutors and then speak to his team.
Rachel, the former president's demeanor as he left that courtroom?
Stoic, stern. He quickly rose up. He was allowed to exit through a side door. And there was one moment, David, as he was walking out of the room in which he turned back and looked at the members of the press as well as the public that had been seated there. Didn't say anything, didn't utter a word throughout the entire proceeding. He exited, but again, his demeanor, his body language, how stern he was, how restless he was at times, said everything about how the former president feels about today. He wanted to get this over with quickly, and he seemed pretty irritated that he had to come here for this appearance today, David.
And Rachel, one of the other sort of pieces of color that came from the room was the wait in the beginning, that the president was seated for a time, waiting, we were told, up to 10 minutes or so for the federal magistrate judge to enter the courtroom. And we took note of that, too, because obviously as the former president, you become accustomed to not waiting for much, particularly when the stakes are this high. I don't know if you were in the courtroom at that point and you witnessed that as well.
Yes, David, so I was in the courtroom likely for probably about 7 or 8 minutes before the arraignment actually did begin. And I did notice this is when Trump did appear the most restless. He sat with his arms crossed. At times he was sort of swaying. This is when I saw him cross his hands sitting on the desk, at times fiddling with his thumb or moving his hand behind his ear at one point. He was looking around to see when exactly this would begin, and we were wondering what the delay was as well. Obviously, there was so much security, Secret Service in the federal courthouse behind me. It took a while for members of the press, for members of the public to get in that room and to be seated. We all had to be screened before going in. So that is likely probably some of the reason for that delay. But the former president, again, was sitting there for a period of time waiting for this to begin. And something that you just mentioned, David, this is the former president of the United States. Things typically start when he wants them to start. He's never commanded to rise as he was in the courtroom today, to sit through and listen to everything that the judge was saying, the back and forth between his defense team and the prosecutors. And you could tell that he was ready for this to be over with. He was ready to move on, ready to enter that not guilty plea and get out of the room.
And one last question for you, Rachel, just to give you a break. Excellent color here from the courtroom. Did the president utter ever a word during the proceeding today? Was there ever an exchange with the president and the judge over anything?
He did not utter a single word. Obviously, the judge was communicating to the former president, especially when directing him not to communicate with witnesses or with the co-defendant about the facts of this case. But it was Trump's own lawyer that entered the not guilty plea. It was Trump's own lawyer that obviously pushed back against some of what the prosecutors were pushing for here. The former president did not say anything. But David, I cannot underscore enough how the mood and the demeanor, his body language communicated so much what the former president was feeling. Stern, stoic, at times restless, and he was ready for this certainly all to be over, David.
Rachel Scott, who made her way back down from that 13th floor courtroom, having taken copious notes we could see there for a time, Rachel, and we really do appreciate it because in cases like these and with something of this significance, it's so important to have eyes and ears inside that room, and we were lucky enough to have you there today. So Rachel, thank you. We continue to watch these live pictures, and again, you know, I hate to say that I hope people haven't become numb to this kind of image, but here we are again watching aerial views of former President Trump's motorcade after a criminal indictment, this time, though, on the federal level, 37 counts, pleading not guilty through his attorney just a short time ago. And as we just passed the 4 o'clock mark here in the East, John Santucci, you have learned that there's going to be a stop here for the motorcade. Talk us through that and then where the motorcade heads next.
So, David, I'm being told in real time, per sources close to the former president, that they are indeed making a stop at a local business. We're not sure exactly what that is. This was a conversation that I had been heard for the last couple of days, that before heading back to the airport, before heading back to Bedminster, there were conversations about getting out there, showing the former president. Because, David, you noted earlier at the start of our coverage, we haven't seen Donald Trump so far today. We didn't see him exit Doral like we saw him exit at Trump Tower. We didn't see him yet board a plane or anything like that, and we didn't see him enter court. So a conversation amongst the campaign team is that, look, we need to show our guy once we get out of court. We need to show people that he's tough, he's strong, that he's resilient, defiant. And I think that body language demeanor that Rachel is talking about right now, we have heard he is quite angry for the last couple of days. I imagine, David, wherever this motorcade is heading right now, and we're checking with our sources, that is Donald Trump that we're going to see in some way, shape, or form.
Any way to know yet, John, whether he's traveling alone again on the backside of this motorcade?
I do, David. He is alone in the motorcade. He is just with the Secret Service detail. The cars are manifested in a certain way, so my sense is that that actually held, that he is in the same car by himself with the agents, the lawyers right behind him.
John Carl, the former president, by himself. This is surely sinking in, and you have reported, John Santucci has reported, that the president is fully aware of what's at stake here and the gravity of what he's facing.
And the contrast with the demeanor in that courtroom and what we're going to see from him if he stops at a business, as they're saying he will, or when we see him tonight when he's up in Bedminster, little mini rally at his golf club. We'll hear the bravado. We'll hear the attacks on the special counsel. We'll hear the attacks on the FBI, on the deep state, all of the greatest hits of Donald Trump portraying himself as a victim. But the bottom line is, when he was in that courtroom before that magistrate judge, sitting in front of Jack Smith right over his shoulder, what did he say? He said nothing. He was entirely silent. He had a right to enter his plea on his own. He had a right to speak. He certainly could have looked at Jack Smith. He could have turned around. He could have said something to him. He said nothing. He was silent. His demeanor described now, we've heard from Rachel Scott. We've heard from Olivia Rubin. This was somebody who was clearly cowed, uncomfortable, didn't want to be there. Not the kind of Donald Trump that we're accustomed to seeing, hunched over and silent. Be a very different Donald Trump we see when he stops by wherever he's going to stop.
Yeah, and it's our understanding that we're about a minute or two away potentially from this stop at a local business in South Florida. As John Santucci reported a short time ago, a political calculation by those around the president who are helping to make these campaign decisions moving forward, that they needed to show their candidate after this moment in history, appearing, they hope, in a moment of strength at a small business of their choosing on the way to the airport. And again, as John Carl just pointed out, and as we've said before, he will then fly back to New Jersey. He'll hold a rally tonight. He'll likely return to some of the very same talking points. And if history predicts what we'll see in the coming hours and days, there'll be fundraising attempts off of what we saw. And that will likely work because it does rally his core support. Many who do support and follow Donald Trump obviously have huge questions and huge reservations about what they have seen play out today. Then there's another part of the country, and the polling shows this, that believes that given what is included in that 49-page indictment, that the charges were warranted. Again, a very polarized country, very difficult times, but not a difficult indictment to read for anyone. The opinions of that indictment, though, are varied, and we know that. It's the Versailles restaurant in South Florida, we are told, which is where the motorcade is now stopping. These are decisions made by the campaign, and of course, that is always vetted. They're not going to pop into a place unexpected after a 37-count sort of indictment in federal court. John Santucci, this is a decision they wanted to make in order to show a moment of strength on the backside of this.
This was indeed a moment that they wanted to have, David, an image they wanted to capture. I'm told that this was a business specifically picked to get out there and talk to voters. And as our colleagues Gio Benitez and Victor Arquendo note, they both covered Miami, Florida. This is a stop and a location that many political candidates have made over the last 50-plus years. It is a strong, well-known restaurant in the Cuban community, a key voting bloc for any political candidate, but especially for somebody running for the White House and a third time, as we know, with Donald Trump. But this is something that, it's funny, I've covered Donald Trump for nearly a decade, David, as you know. These are stops that Donald Trump doesn't typically like. I've been to diners, I've been to restaurants, I've been to Hammeries in South Carolina with Donald Trump. These are not the things that he typically enjoys. But I think for moments like this is where the campaign team won. I'm told that Trump was hesitant to make this stop for the last couple of days, but the campaign team saying very clearly, we need to get out there, we need to look strong, let's do it. Clearly, David, that's where we are right now.
Why do you think he doesn't like these stops?
It's interesting. It puts Donald Trump in a setting where, we know this is a guy that even pre-COVID was a bit of a germaphobe, didn't like always the gland handing and the shaking hands and being around people. But clearly, it's a moment they know they need to have. Donald Trump, I remember going to a diner with him, I think it was in New Hampshire the first time, and he actually leaned over to the press and said, so what am I supposed to do? It's a little awkward for Donald Trump. He's not like most families that end up in a diner on the weekends. It's not something that typically Donald Trump does.
And here we see the first images now. Again, Donald Trump making a stop after appearing in federal court here this afternoon in Miami. He's at Cafe Versailles. This is Little Havana, and this is a popular spot for the campaign trail, part of the Cuban exile community. Cheers for the former president there. Indeed, shaking hands. And some smiles. And of course, this was a decision made by those in this small circle that now travels with Donald Trump. Go ahead, John.
We were just looking at these pictures with you, David. We're looking to see if Walt Nauta is in the restaurant with him. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, he's obviously in the motorcade, and as we showed the images earlier, by his side. But we do see his Secret Service detail right with him, see some advisors as he's working the room.
Is there any plan, John, for him to address the cameras at this point?
We've heard that was something that was possible, David. I think they were going to work through the logistics of the room. You can obviously see that it's quite crowded right now. I know that was something that he had hoped to do, to at least speak to a camera. We know that the pool camera, that's, of course, one of the networks that's picked to travel with any candidate. We know the pool camera is something that's right there trained on him. Trump knows, as you well know, to find a camera, so it's certainly possible.
Communism will not come to our shores. Talking with members of the Cuban exile community there, Terry Moran, and not surprising that his political team and this campaign would suggest, you know what, you should make a stop here on the way to the airport.
Should make a stop because this is the plan to make his personal trial on criminal charges in the federal court in Florida part of his political identity, and bind the two as tightly together as possible so that the prosecution of him is the persecution of his supporters. That's his message. And obviously, that's something that will be tested. He will have tens of millions of people who will agree with that. Tens of millions of Americans already demonstrate that they agree with that. Is it enough? Is it enough to win the Republican nomination? Is it enough to win the White House again? That's the question before us, and part of it will be answered by the evidence in this case and the jury who decides it. I think a lot of voters are holding fire right now. Of course, his fiercest partisans will be with him and his fiercest opponents against him. But I think there are a lot of Americans want to see what's going on in this case for real. And that will come out in the course of the trial. I think it's also a personal moment for him. Every politician, and even before he ran for office, Donald Trump was something of a politician. They're people persons. They're people. This boosts him. Look, he was in that courtroom, as Rachel Scott so vividly described, down. probably depressed, maybe contemptuous and angry, negative emotions. Because a courtroom is a great equalizer of people. If you're a defendant in a courtroom, even if you got a lot of money and a motorcade.
Let's listen into this for a moment, if we could.
Thank you very much, darling. You take care of yourself. Where's Jorge?
Paul Nada, his aide, who has been brought in on the special counsel indictment, facing a count himself, is in the cafe here with him. We saw him helping to work the room. And as we see on these campaign moments, the photographs. And for those who get a photograph inside this cafe, what a piece of history they'll have, you know, in looking back on this day. Rachel Scott, a difference in temperament here from what you witnessed in that courtroom just a short time ago.
A complete 180 from what we saw inside that courtroom. And David, I cannot underscore enough how striking this is to see the former president.
They're wishing the president a happy birthday tomorrow. Is his birthday? He'll turn 77 years old tomorrow. Applause for him. Sort of touch and go in this moment. Apologies, Rachel. We just wanted to see if the mic would pick up some of what the former president is saying. Let's just listen for just one more moment here. Taking photos with patrons in that cafe before heading to the airport again to fly back to Bedminster.
I think it's going great. I think it's a rigged deal here. We have a rigged country. We have a country that's corrupt. We have a country that's got no borders. We have a country that's got nothing but problems. We're a nation in decline. And then they do this stuff. And you see where the people are. We love the people. And you see where they are. You see the crowds and everything else. We have a country that is in decline like never before, and we can't let it happen. I'm going to make a little speech tonight in Bedminster, and I hope you're going to be there. Can you start tomorrow? You're going to be there. You can come too if you want. Okay? Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Again, here you have it, the former president, a short time after being in that federal courtroom saying, I think it's going great, to an initial question from the crowd, not clear whether the question was about the case or something else. He went on to say, we are a country that's corrupt. He said, a country in decline. He said he's going to be making a speech later today in Bedminster, always very good at teasing the next appearance, which is what he did there moments ago, inviting people who were in that cafe, in fact, if they could make it up to Bedminster. Though we do know the president himself will head there. He'll fly out on his plane a short time from now. And Rachel, I want to bring you back in since we had to take a moment, a break for a moment, just to listen in to the former president. But you were taking note of just the stark contrast in temperament and in tone from what you witnessed.
A complete 180 from what we saw just minutes ago when the former president was here at this federal courthouse. It is striking to see a twice indicted former president of the United States, the first former president to face federal criminal charges, posing with supporters with his thumbs up shortly after being arraigned, not to mention his co-defendant in this indictment standing just a few feet away from him. They're still close together. The judge instructed that they would not be allowed to talk about the facts of the case, but given his close proximity to the former president, given that Walton Nada works for the former president, he would still be allowed to continue his job in what he does for former President Donald Trump. But this is a total shift from the former president, from what I just personally witnessed inside of that courtroom. Trump was stoic, he was restless, he was ready to move on. Clearly, he's eager to get back out in front of his supporters and paint his own narrative about what he believes this indictment is. But this is a complete and total mood shift in tone and demeanor from what we just saw here at this federal courthouse not too long ago, David.
And Rick Klein, our political director, just as you suggested, the campaign moves forward and immediately.
Yeah, and it's a reminder of how much of the narrative from here President Trump, the former president, controls. The lawyers in this case, the attorneys with Jack with Jack Smith's team have to make their case in court. They are bound by the walls of that courtroom for their filings, for their statements. Donald Trump can go out there and say basically whatever he wants as much as he wants. And as you guys all know, the way that he has been able to dominate the public narrative over the past 8+ years has been unlike anything we've ever seen. And he can just keep out there hitting it and hitting the themes consistently. We're seeing him already incorporate this into a public defense that makes this part of a political persecution, that makes this about an attempt to not just bring him down, but to bring down the movement that he inspired. And he has the loyalties of so many millions of Americans. That is what he is going to channel into the campaign that has already begun.
And in the short term, Rick, he calls it a persecution. We're covering the prosecution, obviously, this 49-page indictment, but at least in the short run, it's actually helped Donald Trump in some of the polling against his Republican opponents, including the one who's closest to him, Ron DeSantis, but Donald Trump has increased his lead.
Yeah, so striking to see the way that the polls have shifted just in the last 2 months since that indictment in Manhattan. We've seen almost every public poll, his lead against Ron DeSantis, widen. No other candidates are making significant ground, significant headway. And the way that he is dominating the field continues to this day. Just today, Nikki Haley, who just yesterday suggested that these were serious crimes, one of Trump's primary opponents, is now saying that she might be inclined to pardon him were he to be convicted. That's a line that we've heard from some other candidates that aren't polling that well right now. So think about that. These are people that think they are a better choice than Donald Trump, that want to defeat Donald Trump. And they are making now public pledges around potentially pardoning him if he is convicted in these charges.
Really interesting. Some stark contrast, though, among the Republican candidates. I know they're being pressed on this pardon question. But as we stick with these live pictures, and for those of you watching here in the East, for many of you, your local news is just about 10 minutes away here. So stay tuned for developments on the local level. But as we continue to watch this motorcade, we're going to wrap up with a couple of important questions about the turns this will take, at least in the short run here in the next couple of weeks. First of all, this political calculation that Rick Klein was just talking about. And we knew this would happen. We'll stick with this picture, but let's talk about a couple of candidates who've sort of staked their place. Chris Christie overnight, John Carl, at a town hall, essentially just drawing a line, saying what you've seen here is not acceptable, not just. And he did not hold back. We knew he might take down that role of attack dog. He's a former federal prosecutor himself, but he came out quick and ready to take on Donald Trump last night.
No equivocation whatsoever from Chris Christie. He did it with the first indictment, even before he was a candidate, saying this is very bad for Donald Trump. Now he is saying it is essentially disqualifying. And further, he is hitting Donald Trump with perhaps the greatest insult you can direct toward him, calling him a loser. Saying this is a man who is a loser, and if we follow him, the Republican Party follows a path of losing.
And he spoke of vanity.
And so it's personal and it's direct, and it comes. Remember, David, you were there. Chris Christie was the first major prominent Republican endorsement of candidate Donald Trump in 2016, a game-changing endorsement, the first real major Republican figure to come out and support him, and was his supporter right up through the 2020 campaign. So seeing him turn as hard as he has turned is significant. It's also significant, David, that he's an outlier. That by and large, the other candidates have been much more muted in their criticism of Donald Trump. Some of them outright coming to his defense. Even Ron DeSantis, who perhaps is the most significant threat to Trump's path to the nomination at this point, has not quite defended Trump, but he's attacked the Justice Department, and he has attacked. He has suggested that this is a political prosecution.
And just a few moments left here of this motorcade heading back to the airport now, and then we'll turn you back over to your local stations and your local news. Sarah Isker, I wanted to bring you back in. You worked under the Trump Justice Department, under the Bush administration as well in the Justice Department. And you were saying earlier that the more attention that Donald Trump is able to gain from these headlines, at least in the short term, listen, he faces significant legal hurdles here. There's no question about that. But at least in the short term, the oxygen that he takes from the other candidates is something that will be measured, certainly, in polling in the days to come.
His legal team's going to need to arm wrestle with his political team. Dan and Kate were talking about why, as a legal matter, you'd want to stretch this out. You want all the motions about evidence, et cetera, to play out, and that could take a long time. On the other hand, as a political matter, everything Donald Trump is doing right now is starving all of the other potential 2024 GOP rivals of oxygen. Nobody's paying attention to what Tim Scott is saying on Twitter or what Ron DeSantis is doing in Iowa. That is good for the frontrunner. He can run out the clock. And in that sense, this may be something that Donald Trump wants to sort of keep that balloon popping up into the air, which may mean a trial more quickly.
And on this question, Mary Bruce is watching all afternoon with us, too, from her post at the White House, our chief White House correspondent. The president has not weighed in on this. In fact, he said no comment when was pressed late last week after the indictment was made public. Other than the First Lady making news in the last 24 hours, what more have we heard from the White House on this? What's transpired today?
The White House is not commenting on this. The president is not commenting on it. And their plan is to try as hard as they can not to comment on it going forward. But it is clear that they certainly, are a little frustrated by this, to say the least, because of the fact that Jill Biden made that comment last night at that fundraiser saying that she finds it a little shocking that Republicans don't seem to care about the indictment. There's clearly frustration within the Biden camp that the indictment of the Republican frontrunner isn't seeming to sway his supporters at all. And the fact that you see Donald Trump, there's nothing more defiant than going from a courtroom straight to get a Cuban sandwich. And he is sending a clear message, not just to his supporters, but also to those other Republican candidates and Republican leaders in Washington who, let's be honest, are a little bit conflicted right now about the future of the Donald Trump campaign. He is sending the Republican Party a clear message in doing this, that he is not backing down, he is not stepping away, he is here to stay, and he is going to continue to soak up that oxygen, as Sarah was saying, for as long as he can.
And Mary, you touched on it there, and I know for our viewers who might have joined us in progress during our coverage today, we mentioned it at the very top several hours ago, but it was the First Lady who made news. And what exactly did she say?
The First Lady, speaking behind closed doors to fundraisers where often your guard is down a little bit, she told donors that she finds it a little shocking that Republicans don't seem to care about the Trump indictment. And she referenced some of the latest polling, which Rick Klein has gone into detail explaining that, it's really shown that the Trump indictment hasn't had much of a dent in terms of his support amongst the American people. I think that has been surprising, certainly, to Donald Trump's rivals in this race, and surprising clearly to the Biden team and this White House.
Even when polling also tells a story of people who, when they read the indictment, there are a lot of Americans who believe the charges are warranted.
Absolutely. Even those in our polling back in May, even a majority of Americans who said that they thought that the president should be charged for his handling of classified documents, 21% of those said they would still support him anyway. And that is what you are seeing play out here. I think the question is, does that support last as we see this case play out? And of course, on the flip side, how long is the Biden team going to stay silent on this? Because at face value, you certainly would think that the president would want to seize on the indictment of his top rival.
Well, as soon as you hear anything from the White House, you'll let us know, Mary. Less than 5 minutes here before we get you right to your local news in much of the country. Pierre Thomas, there's another person who plays a large role in this day, in these events, and that is Jack Smith, who was in that courtroom. And just his presence made a statement there today.
Clearly trying to show leadership, clearly trying to rally the troops, because they have a long road ahead of them, particularly the prosecutors who will prosecute this case. It will be many long days. There will be lots of motions by the defense side that they have to address. But I think today, him coming was again to send a signal to Donald Trump as well. We're not going anywhere. We're bringing this case full steam.
And if there's a conviction, and we're a long way off from that, we'll have to see how this all plays out. But if there is, we're talking about the potential for prison time here. So in the short term, we're all talking about a stop at a cafe in Little Havana and then the Bedminster rally just a few hours from now. But big picture here, Pierre, this is something we just haven't seen before.
Have not seen before. The president faces decades in prison if convicted on all these counts. And I'm also struck today as we end up here with Mr. Nada, who was in that visual we just saw.
He's the aide who's also indicted here.
Also indicted. And he didn't have counsel today. Did not have counsel. And he's going to have to show up in a few weeks by himself. And even though in the moment everything is as normal, he's right there with the president, but he can't talk about this case with the president. And we just have to watch that very closely, what happens to Mr. Nada going forward.
John Carl, you've interacted with the president, the former president, often. Take us inside that motorcade riding alone, both on the way to the courthouse and now on the way to the airport.
Well, it was a show of defiance at Versailles in Miami, but looking at Donald Trump, he looked like he wanted to get it over with too. He was going, you know, he wanted to go in there, he wanted to make that appearance, and he wanted to move on. By the way, regarding whether this leads to conviction, Trump has said that he's going to run even if he is convicted. Nothing is going to stop him. And he will do what he has already done, which is make the prosecution of him, which he describes as a persecution of him, the centerpiece of his campaign.
And as we know, in law, nothing does stop him, even if there's a conviction.
No.
And as Dan
He can
Abrams
run
has
from a jail
suggested,
cell.
with just about a minute and a half left, you've suggested if he wins a second term, not in a row here, but returns to the presidency, he can make it go away.
Look, he's potentially campaigning for his freedom here. If he wins the election, it changes everything, as long as this case isn't resolved. And again, even if they have a trial, there will be appeals.
Right.
This definitely will not be completely resolved by the time of the election unless there is a trial and an acquittal. Anything short of a trial and an acquittal, this is going on past the time of the election.
And there's no overstating, Kate Shaw, the role that Aileen Cannon will now take as she presides over this case moving forward.
Right. We may see this wrap before Americans next go to the polls and decide who their next president will be, and we may not, and that sort of lies in the hands of this judge, Aileen Cannon.
All right. Kate Shaw, Dan Abrams, John Carl, Pierre Thomas, and those are just the few who are in the room. Rachel Scott, of course, was in that courtroom today, and our entire team. I thank you for the extremely careful reporting. We all recognize the weight of this day in a country that is deeply divided about what you're witnessing play out. But these are live pictures. Obviously, the president, the former president, Donald Trump, returning to the airport. He will return to the Northeast this evening. He'll be back at Bedminster right around world news time. He'll be delivering a rally in which he will likely go after the special counsel and this case against him, the 37-count indictment. We have never seen it. Obviously, federal criminal charges against a former president. I'm David Muir. I'll be back with the entire team for a special edition of World News Tonight a short time from now. Your local news for much of you is next.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Track identification. Left, right. 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 Left, right.